Hello, brother. How was your day today? If possible, please let me know where you are on Earth. As for me, my day was quite boring. Let me share it with you. Today at school, there was a quiet debate brewing in the corner of the library. A tangle of history and those unsettling historical mysteries that refused to sit still. And the question that lodged itself under the skin was simple. Why did certain Soviet technologies appear, stun the world, and then vanish as if erased by a careful hand? After this video, you'll never look at the world the same way. Before the tension gets too high, take a moment to like the episode and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment with location and local time. These hours we share matter to the pacing of truth. Now, dim the lights, prepare yourself, and let's unravel this hidden truth together. You are examining declassified photographs and contradictory memos that seem to talk around what they refuse to name, tracing the outline of ambitions both vast and volatile. And you notice how the story of forbidden Soviet tech does not begin with one machine, but with a posture and empire building. At the edge of physics, while refusing to admit how close it stood to the abyss, the first verifiable anchor in this maze is the Caspian Sea Monster, an experimental ground effect vehicle conceived in the 1960s by Rostislav Alexiev's design bureau. It was so unusual that American analysts first misread satellite imagery, thinking they were looking at a plane that should not be able to fly that low, that fast, for that long over water. The KM wasn't a myth. It skimmed the sea surface by riding a cushion of air, a practical exploitation of fluid dynamics that made it stealthy to radar and terrifying in tactical potential. Yet its immense size and the cold precision of its lines read like an omen. Something built to slither beneath visibility and therefore vanish from view whenever those in charge decided that visibility had become dangerous. But the real question remained. If the innovation was real and the physics sound, why does the record feel deliberately thin, curated, and discontinuous? You are standing over a long table of dossiers. And each folder tells a similar story, demonstrable achievement paired with silence at the moment of culmination, so the psychological pattern emerges. Systems built to guarantee control often end up creating uncertainty as a byproduct, leading their stewards to prefer absence over accountability. Consider another fixed point. Polyaskiff, the 80-ton prototype that rode the Energia booster in May 1987. A craft associated with anti-satellite laser concepts and space-based demonstrations failed to reach orbit due to guidance issues during a complex orientation maneuver after separation. In the official sequence, it yawed and rolled, then fired at the wrong attitude, orbiting into the Pacific. The hardware existed, the launch occurred, the loss was recorded, and then the narrative dissolves into fewer declarations and more insinuations about what might have been tested had it lived longer than a single flight arc. The psychological dimension here is as important as the engineering. When a state apparatus bets prestige on a weaponized spectacle and stumbles in public view, it sometimes chooses not post-mortem but erasure. Ritual shrinking of memory that feels safer than admitting structural fragility. But the real question remained, was the mission's failure merely technical? Or was the subsequent quiet a strategic choice to keep the ambition but bury the proof? You are reading the signatures of power in the negative space, the things not said. The program's not memorialized and your skepticism sharpens. The vanishing is not random decay but patterned retreat. The doomsday tempered perimeter system known in the West as Dead Hand is a documented architecture from the late Cold War, a failed deadly network designed to ensure retaliation even if commanding elements were destroyed, a mechanism that both displaces human judgment and amplifies its ghost in the machine. Evidence across open sources indicates it was built to monitor seismic, radiation, pressure, and communications cues, then transmit pre-authorized launch orders under certain conditions if enabled during crises. The fact of its existence is a concrete pillar in the landscape of Soviet strategic automation, yet its most intimate details remain screened by layers of operational secrecy and doctrinal ambiguity, as if the safest version of deterrence was the one that could be denied in the daylight while palpably present at midnight. This is the personality of classified historical information, tactile in the traces, evasive in the center, and always a beat away from disappearing when political weather changes. But the real question remained. How much of what seems to have vanished still hums in the background? Active but renamed, institutionalized but deniable. You are cataloging three kinds of disappearance: the physical loss of prototypes to crash, corrosion, or budget death; the archival quiet that follows projects whose optics turned inconvenient; and the strategic burial of technologies into black programs or successor institutions that inherit the capability but sever its lineage in public memory. The Caspian Sea Monster-esque narrative hits all three. Operational constraints like wave height and corrosion undermined deployment's prestige, wavered, and leadership interests thinned. Then an accident sealed the end of that specific platform, while elements of the concept surfaced later in niche research and export curiosity remnants without a flagship. With Polyos, the body fell, but the anatomy of its idea, space-based sensor effects platform. Integration lessons, heavy lift interfaces diffused into later civil hardware and doctrine studies, as the official story focused on guidance failure and the unofficial story whispered about intentions that could never be publicly tested. In strategic psychology, this is the conservation of capability under the cover of failure. Define the event as an end. Use the debris as insulation and keep the questions larger than the answers. But the real question remained. When the public sees a program's tombstone, is it witnessing an obituary or a deliberate misdirection? You are attentive to quirks that recur like fingerprints across different files, odd phrasings, anomalous timelines, in the sense that when a technology's primary value lies in being unseen, the most rational administrative act is to render it invisible, even to history. One such quirk is how official descriptions emphasize prototype or demonstration at the very point where a system would become operationally decisive. A linguistic brake pedal that lets leadership step away without reputational skid marks. Another is the consistent presence of plausible mundane facts, guidance sensor fault stripped from another spacecraft, wave height. Limitations, resource constraints at the edge of state collapse, shrew on its own terms while simultaneously serving as a perfect exit ramp from further disclosure. This is how power arranges its own memory palace. Every door opens onto a corridor, and every corridor bends just out of sight. But the real question remained, are these corridors designed to protect secrets from enemies, or to protect decision-makers from their own past decisions? You are now close enough to feel the hum, a low administrative vibration where ambitions exceed doctrine, where innovation lives on the edge of deniability, and the essential hypothesis clarifies. Certain Soviet technologies did not merely fail or fade. They were curated out of view through a mix of accident, austerity, doctrinal pivot, and conscious archival strategy. The record of the Ekranoplan demonstrates the physics and the presence. The record of Polyus demonstrates the reach and the recoil. The record of Perimeter demonstrates the philosophy that would justify burying capabilities in the dark if daylight threatened their deterrent value. Across these cases, the vanishing is not absence, but a mode of presence calibrated to be unfalsifiable to outsiders and survivable to insiders. But the real question remained. When peering into these carefully managed silences, what responsibility falls on the observer to accept mystery or to articulate the patterns that mystery was designed to obscure? You are standing on a wind-scoured concrete apron beside a hulking relic with 4 tracks splayed like a steel arachnid, and the first sensation is disbelief that anyone ever expected this thing to glide across a battlefield. Yet the paperwork says it did, at least in trials, and that its hull was sculpted to survive a world no sane person would wish to enter. Object 279, designated Object 279, was a late 1950s experimental heavy tank engineered with an elliptical, all-cast armored hull. And for low-pressure track assemblies to reduce ground pressure and resist minefields and soft terrain? An answer to the nightmare scenario of fighting under nuclear conditions, when blast-over pressure could flip ordinary tanks like toys? The design included an NBC protection system, sloped multi-layer armor, and in some descriptions, an external anti-heat shield around the hull, giving it a bulbous alien profile that deflected shaped charges and promised stability in shock waves, a physical manifestation of a doctrine that expected the unthinkable, and then tried to make it survivable. The verifiable record notes that only prototypes were built and testing occurred around 1957 to 1959, with the program ultimately canceled as heavy tanks fell out of favor in Soviet doctrine. One extant example today testifies to the machine's reality even as its lineage dedens in public view. But the real question remained, If the platform solves specific nuclear battlefield problems, why did decision-makers prefer to let it vanish rather than evolve it into a new family of vehicles? You are tracing rivulets of policy through metal, and what emerges is a psychological pattern common to organizations under pressure when paradigms shift. Radical edge case solutions become politically radioactive, more costly to defend than to bury. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, the Soviet transition away from massive heavy tanks toward more versatile main battle tanks made Object 279 a creature of a contested future its advantages, offset by complexity, production burdens, and strategic ambiguity about how often anyone would truly fight in a nuclear dust storm. The four-track configuration promised superb mobility on swampy or churned terrain, yet it also demanded specialized maintenance and logistics. While the 130mm M65 gun and advanced fire control features pushed the boundaries of what could be reliably fielded at scale in that era, so the tank becomes a symbol of a larger truth. Sometimes an institution builds the perfect tool for the wrong future. And rather than admit the misprediction, it grants the artifact a quiet, dignified disappearance. But the real question remained: did elements of its survivability ground pressure targets, anti-heat shaping, internalized fuel beams silently echo into later designs under different names? You are shifting to another concrete labyrinth on the Kazakh steppe, where a different kind of beam once hummed, not kinetic but photonic, and the aura here is rumor-braided with documentation. Terra 3, the laser testing center at Surishagin, whose purpose traveled a long path from missile defense exploration to sensor tracking experiments and then into the fog of alleged anti-satellite implications. The sober record states the site housed a visible light ruby laser and an infrared CO2 laser installed in 1979 and 1982, respectively, with tests conducted against targets including aircraft fitted with detectors and satellites, passing overhead revealing that pointing accuracy and atmospheric distortion limited practical weaponization. Accounts from Western analyses emphasize that Terra 3 ultimately fell short of becoming an operational laser weapon, with its most plausible use focused on tracking and perhaps sensor dazzling at low power, an important distinction between fear and feasibility, between a dark legend and a bounded technical reality. The facility was eventually abandoned and partially dismantled. Another example of a project that left a concrete shell and lively myths but only modest documented performance. But the real question remained: if tracking and low-level sensor interference were achievable, what results and lessons slipped behind classification walls as the public story settled on it didn't work? You are evaluating a specific, persistent anecdote that refuses to die. That in October 1984, Terra 3 tracked the space shuttle with a low-power beam, distressing the crew and provoking a diplomatic protest. A story recounted in defense analyzes and enthusiast histories with confident detail, but contested by others who argue the system lacked the power and pointing precision for such effects. On one side, narratives rooted in Jane's style, reporting claim low-power illumination caused malfunctions and crew discomfort. On the other, subsequent disclosures and expert assessments framed Terra 3 as technically incapable of meaningful interference at shuttle altitudes, highlighting the gap between atmospheric propagation limits and sensational claims. The documented core remains clear. Lasers were installed, tracking attempts were made, and the platform underperformed as a weapon. Whether it ever blinded anything is precisely the kind of unresolved thread that institutions learn to live with, because certainty would either embarrass or empower, and neither outcome is comfortable. This is the psychology of the almost weapon. Its most powerful effects happen in the mind, not on the target. But the real question remained: was the ambiguity cultivated to amplify deterrence without admitting capability? Or did ambiguity simply grow in the vacuum of hard data? You are back in a quiet gallery where lunar machines sit under soft lighting and the placard beside one rover bears a date that keeps slipping paperwork into the past. Lunokhod 3 built, but never launched a ghost mission that ends before it begins. The verifiable history is straightforward. After Lunokhod 1 and 2 traversed the moon in the early 1970s, a third rover was planned for 1977, but never flew with. Priority shifting toward Mars missions and budgets redirected, leaving the completed rover as a museum piece at Lavakin. This is not a secret program, but a public absence, a reminder that not every disappearance is deliberate concealment. Sometimes the vanishing is administrative triage, the redirection of finite resources into more fashionable or urgent objectives while successful lines go quiet. Yet even here there is a whisper of continuity because technologies seldom die. They disperse, informing later systems and seeding techniques that reappear in unexpected places. Image transmission protocols, hazard navigation, methods, thermal control lessons revisited by a different generation under a different mission patch. But the real question remained, how many cancellations are really time capsules, waiting for doctrine and funding to catch up with the ideas locked inside them? You are feeling how these cases rhyme. A nuclear survivable tank retired by doctrinal pivot, a laser complex that proved more theater than thrust, and a lunar rover that never left Earth because the agenda moved on. The common denominator is the administrative mind managing uncertainty, an instinct to prune that which requires exceptional justification while retaining fragments of knowledge in more defensible compartments. The strangest technologies create the strongest incentives to disappear, because their very existence invites questions that multiply faster than answers, especially when geopolitics demands clarity and budgets demand consolidation. In that light, the vanishing ceases to look like failure and begins to look like a managerial strategy. Reduce exposure, serve expertise, and let myths do the work of deterrence or distraction as needed. But the real question remained. When encountering a gap in the record, should the observer assume incompetence or recognize the quiet intelligence of selective silence? You are filtering rumor through the sieve of records, holding up what remains to the light and the silhouette. That appears as both unsettling and human. A tiny mummified body found near Kishtim in 1996, nicknamed Alyoshenka, wrapped in hearsay and the kind of grief that attaches to anomalies. The verifiable facts are spare, but firm. A small, deformed human fetus or neonate was reportedly discovered by an elderly woman near Kishtim. Photographed and filmed, then lost after passing through many hands. Subsequent discussions by medical professionals have leaned toward a human origin with severe congenital abnormalities, especially plausible in a region affected historically by nuclear fallout from the 1957 Miak Kishtim disaster. The object's disappearance amplified its legend. But the most grounded interpretation is tragically prosaic. Human remains handled outside formal custody, misinterpreted through lenses hungry for the extraordinary. This is a pattern worth naming: how absence of chain of custody converts pathology into mythology, and how communities living in the long shadow of contamination seek meaning in the inexplicable forms tragedy sometimes takes. But the real question remained: did the vanishing of the specimen serve curiosity and commerce more than truth, ensuring that certainty would stay forever out of reach? You are walking the dry edge of a shrunken sea where the wind picks up dust from a place that was supposed to be isolated forever, and the grit carries stories no archive can fully contain. Vosrastenia Island. Once remote in the Aral Sea, a node in the Soviet biological weapons complex, where open-air tests with pathogens were conducted for decades. The documented record outlines the establishment of Aral 7 in 1954. The presence of the Field Scientific Research Laboratory, and tests involving agents like anthrax, plague, tularemia, and others on tethered animals south of the main lab area. The site was evacuated around 1991-1992 as the USSR collapsed, with later visits by U.S. teams confirming dismantlement of facilities but persisting environmental risks. As the Aral Sea receded, the island grew into a peninsula, increasing the chance of human and animal access to contaminated zones and complicating long-term containment. Environmental aftershock of geopolitical decisions layered atop hydrological calamity. The vanishing here is administrative rather than mythic. A closure order, declared decontamination, and then the slow unspooling of consequences as geography undermines intention. But the real question remained: how much of what was buried in the sand remains viable? And who bears responsibility when the map changes faster than the memory of what the map once hid? You are reading a ledger where the entries alternate between thunder and silence. And the place name written in heavy script is Semipalatinsk, the polygon where the Soviet nuclear Story burned brightest and longest, leaving a palimpsest of radiation data, human testimony, and guarded admissions. The verifiable facts form a stark scaffold: 456 nuclear tests conducted from 1949 to 1989, the first Soviet atomic detonation in 1949, and the first air-tested hydrogen bomb. Widespread exposure of surrounding populations during decades when official acknowledgement was sparse, and buried deeper in post-Soviet disclosures. Tests of radiological weapons concepts in the late 1950s that were ultimately deemed impractical. Later, international assessments characterized general risks as localized with specific high-dose zones restricted, while joint operations secured materials and sealed tunnels in the 1996 to 2012 period, a practical effort to reduce proliferation hazards while managing a complex legacy. The site did not vanish, but its meanings did. Deterrence triumph turned humanitarian reckoning. And then, a managed museum of danger, where access is controlled, yet increasingly documented. But the real question remained: what does closure mean when the science keeps discovering new forms of persistence in soil, bone, and memory? You are attentive to a quieter thread binding these locations: contamination as a social technology, shaping narratives as surely as it shapes health outcomes. In Kishtim's folklore, a malformed body becomes an emissary from elsewhere. On Vos Razdinia, a receding shoreline converts containment into exposure. The official stopping of tests inaugurates a new era of measurement mapping and mitigation that can never quite declare an end. Each site bears a mundane, verifiable truth, an anomalous specimen documented and lost. A bioweapons testing ground opened, operated, and then abandoned. A test site tallying 456 detonations and their residues. Yet each accrues an aura of the unresolved precisely because comprehensive proof, in public, is structurally impossible. This is the psychology of vanishing. Facts persist, artifacts disappear, and meaning migrates to the spaces in between. But the real question remained: when evidence becomes partial by design or by decay? What ethical posture should researchers adopt: skepticism that cools inquiry, or empathy that keeps returning to the scene? You are closing the folder for the night only to notice one final annotation. Radiological weapons tests at the Polygon in 1958 were halted as unfeasible. A bureaucratic judgment that is as moral as it is technical, recognizing that some weapons injure even the logic that proposes them. In that decision lies a model for understanding how certain Soviet technologies vanished. Not because they were unreal, but because they outlived their doctrinal usefulness, exceeded tolerable risk, or collided with a changing world that refused to sustain them. What vanishes from sight does not vanish from consequence. What leaves the ledger enters the landscape. But the real question remained: in the long arc of secrecy and disclosure, ensures that the ledger of consequences stays open when the ledger of projects closes. You are walking through a silent hangar where dust outlines the shape of a dream that did fly once, and it is the quiet that unnerves more than the wreckage. A spaceplane that rose on a thunderhead of kerosene and oxygen circled the Earth twice under full computer control, and landed with such precision that crosswinds became a footnote. The verifiable record is uncontested. The Buran orbiter completed its first and only orbital mission. On November 15, 1988, uncrewed riding the Energia heavy-lift booster and executed a fully automated landing back at Baikonur, within meters of the target. An unprecedented feat that NASA's shuttle never attempted in full autonomy. Then the program, a monumental expense amid a weakening economy, was suspended and officially canceled by 1993, with the orbiter itself destroyed by a hangar roof collapse in 2002. The psychological profile of the project reads like a Cold War mirror, a response to an American program that was itself half weapon, half symbol, yielding a Soviet system technically elegant in ways the original was not, externalizing main propulsion on the booster, building an automation from the start, yet born into a fiscal winter that could not sustain it. The machine did not vanish because it failed. It vanished because success arrived at the wrong moment in political time. But the real question remained: how many of its software architectures, thermal protection insights, and integration lessons migrated quietly into later vehicles and launch operations under different banners? You are tracing the contour of a different silence, vertical and geological, where heat and pressure turn scientific curiosity into urban legend. The Kola Superdeep Borehole, a legitimate research shaft in the Pachansky district that reached 12,262 meters by 1989, still the deepest man-made. Penetration into Earth's crust by true vertical depth. The verified science is austere and fascinating. Expected high porosity at depth, water bound in crystalline structures. Microfossils. Planktonic life in metamorphosed rocks and temperatures high enough to halt further drilling. Yet the public memory is dominated by a myth that screams literally about a microphone lowered into a shaft to record the sounds of torment from below. The Well to Hell. The story emerged in the 1990s and has been repeatedly debunked as a hoax, likely recycling audio from an Italian horror film. But it persists because empty industrial relics and ambiguous closures invite folklore. Where the lab ends, the imagination begins. The project was not abandoned because of demons, but because of heat, cost, and diminishing returns. Precisely the sort of mundane explanations that secrecy-prone eras often fail to communicate compellingly. But the real question remained: why does the collective mind prefer dread to geology? And what responsibility do storytellers bear in separating a real scientific marvel from the theater built around it? You are sketching the outline of a machine that may never have worn its name in public, a helicopter shaped to be a rumor in radar, where flat facets, shrouded hubs, and cooled exhausts turned signature into a design variable. And yet, when seeking Soviet precedents, the record is thin, fragmented, and often redirected into general discourse about low observables rather than specific programs. Stealth as a discipline is verifiable shaping. It's RAM coatings, infrared suppression, acoustic dampening, and its application to rotary wing craft is a global pursuit with well-documented Western examples. It's culminating in public evidence from the 2011 Abbottabad crash revealing a heavily modified UH-60 with reduced signatures.
However explicit.
Soviet or Russian invisible helicopter projects rarely surface beyond hints of RCS reduction research and sensor countermeasures embedded in broader avionics and airframe work. The psychology here is instructive. A capability that only functions if unannounced will leave. By design, an absence that resembles non-existence. An analyst must read the negative space materials research, intake geometries, and patent trails rather than a neat designation. The most defensible stance admits both the plausibility of focused experiments and the absence of public proof of a fielded Soviet stealth helicopter, which is precisely the kind of gap that becomes fertile soil for retellings untethered to documents. But the real question remained: how do historians balance inference from general stealth practice with the ethical restraint of not conjuring programs that archives do not yet reveal? You are noticing how these three disappearances carry different flavors. Baran's is a fiscal eclipse of a technical sunrise. Kola's is a folklore overlay thick enough to obscure profound geology. Stealth rotorcraft traces are a deliberate shadow cast by a discipline that only thrives in darkness. In each there is at least one verifiable fact that fixes the story to Earth. Baran's 1988 automated flight. Kola's 262-meter depth. The global record of stealth methodology, and its later helicopter manifestations, as the surrounding narrative bends toward either spectacle or silence. This is where transformative analysis earns its keep, by connecting the engineering to the institutional psychology, showing how budgets and beliefs filter what survives in memory. And yet, the open question lingers, when absence itself becomes a technology of deterrence, of myth-making, of bureaucratic risk management. How can observers avoid filling the void with either wishful thinking or performative cynicism? We're filing the day's notes with a final observation: the Soviet archive, like any archive, is not a neutral warehouse, but a curated space. And the curation favors continuity for some projects and oblivion for others, regardless of their empirical success. Baran teaches that a perfect landing cannot outvote a collapsing treasury. Kola teaches that a perfect depth cannot outshout a perfect hoax. Stealth research teaches that a perfect secret looks, from the outside, like nothing at all. The vanishing, then, is neither a single conspiracy nor a single confession. It is a composite effect arising whenever systems that prize control discover that visibility is a liability. But the real question remained: In the chapters ahead, when examining weapons that think, islands that infect, and machines that skim the sea like sentences underlined in blue water, will the pattern harden into a lore? Will each case keep its own sly exceptions, reminding that history prefers nuance to closure? You are seated in a narrow, fluorescent-lit room, where oscilloscopes draw soft green signatures across their screens, and the air seems to carry a low, persistent thrum that might just be the building. Sold wiring, or something tuned to nerves rather than ears, a signal shaped to slip beneath language and tug on. Mood itself, which is precisely the promise and peril that Soviet-era psychotronics wrapped in technical jargon and bureaucratic caution for decades. The verifiable anchor is straightforward. By the early 1970s, a commission under the Central Committee's auspices investigated psychic and bioenergetic phenomena, with members later acknowledging they treated certain effects as real while noting that the transmission channels remained unknown, reflecting an institutional willingness to treat mind-matter interactions as a defense topic rather than a parlor trick, the mere existence of that commission. And symposiums around psychotronics in 1970 and 1973 points to an organized research effort that mirrored, competed with, and at times was justified by perceived Western programs, embedding unusual lines of inquiry into otherwise sober defense bureaucracies. But the real question remained: when a state declares that a phenomenon is real, but its mechanism is unknown, does it amplify curiosity or fear? In which of those emotions does power find more useful to govern outcomes? You are examining a metal box the size of a Dr. S bag, with vents and dials labeled in Cyrillic, a device associated with therapeutic claims yet persistently rumored to blur into behavior influence, a class of LIDA, machines reported to emit low-frequency modulated radio signals intended to calm or sedate with Western researchers in the 1980s obtaining specimens and reporting trans-like effects in animal models under controlled conditions. The documented descriptions emphasize a 40 MHz carrier with low-frequency modulation, multisensory outputs including light and sound, and the assertion, never fully resolved in the open literature, that such fields could entrain or influence central nervous system rhythms, which became a springboard for broader speculation about non-lethal crowd control or covert mood alteration. The bizarre detail arrives via a recurring anecdote, a Soviet photograph purporting to show an auditorium lulled to sleep by a LIDA on a podium. A tableau that functions rhetorically like a magic trick, plausible enough to unsettle, unverifiable enough to endure. But the real question remained: if the device's effects are real, yet bounded, who benefits from allowing its legend to sprawl beyond its data into the realm of auditorium-scale mesmerism? You are turning pages in declassified files where careful analysts catalog conferences, institutes, and personnel, translating a landscape of psychoenergetics and psychotronics into procurement language. And the tone is pragmatic rather than mystical. Track capabilities, estimate risks. Project timelines, U.S. defense and intelligence reporting in the 1970s-1980s. Tally dozens of Soviet and Allied facilities working on anomalous cognition and biofield effects, sometimes framing potential threats in stark terms: remote influence on leadership behavior, disruption of equipment, or strategic intelligence access more as a horizon of possibilities than as confirmed capacities. This was a competitive mirror. Western alarm helped justify Soviet budgets, and Soviet interest helped validate Western pilots. A feedback loop where the existence of any program became both cause and effect of the other side's anxiety. But the real question remained: when both adversaries fund research largely to prevent surprise, how many of the resulting capabilities exist primarily inside briefing binders rather than on any battlefield? You are in a Moscow Institute corridor where a portrait of a bearded researcher watches from above, a display case of patents and reels of magnetic tape. And the placard outlines a career that crystallizes the era's ambitions and controversies. Igor Smirnov, proponent of acoustic psychocorrection, a technique claiming to embed subliminal messages into auditory signals to modulate behavior without conscious awareness. The public trail includes reports that Smirnov's methods were courted for influence operations and therapeutic applications, mentions of military interest during the Afghan War. In an episode in 1993, when U.S. law enforcement reportedly consulted Him during the Waco siege before declining to deploy his proposals, an encounter that pushed his name into Western media and then back into disputed territory. The institutional oddity is that proposals about subconscious influence sometimes traveled the same diplomatic bags as technical exchanges about perfectly ordinary medical devices, entwining legitimate clinical neuromodulation with speculative behavioral control in ways that made later disentanglement nearly impossible. But the real question remained: when a technology claims to alter will while bypassing consent, can any public evaluation be trusted? Or does the claim's very premise ensure that proof, if it exists, will be ethically inaccessible? You are mapping the ecosystem of organizations that gave psychotronics a bureaucratic home, noting that ministry-linked representatives served on international associations and that research convenings in Prague and Moscow blended parapsychology, bioelectromagics, and defense-adjacent speculation under a single tent labeled as national security curiosity rather than fringe. The paper trail shows Soviet and Czechoslovakian collaborations, institute rosters, and proceedings that speak in the dialect of state science grants apparatus. Statistical methods yet often end with conclusions that hover at the edge of reproducibility. A liminal zone where classification can shelter both promising anomalies and fragile claims. Even the nomenclature psychotronics, psychoenergetics, signals an attempt to engineer legitimacy through language, converting centuries of esoteric vocabulary into technocratic categories that committees can fund and auditors can count. But the real question remained: does the creation of a category bring a phenomenon closer to truth? Or merely closer to budgets that will demand results faster than science can supply them? You are back with the humming box, the lab cat, the oscilloscope trace, and the guard at the door who asks for a pass with more stamps than a simple therapy device should ever require. And the psychological interpretation clicks into place. Ambiguity is not a failure mode here. It is a resource to be managed. A device demonstrated to calm animals within minutes becomes, in rumor, a crowd pacifier. A commission that accepts anomalies as real becomes, in retellings, an authorization for mind control. An institute's patent portfolio becomes a cipher for unseen deployments, and the absences in the archive play their part with exquisite timing. This is the administrative art of the almost weapon. Nurture enough possibility to deter and attract funding. Constrain enough disclosure to avoid falsification, and let the aura of the forbidden do the rest. But the real question remained: in a world where perception shapes strategy, really controls whom the subjects under the signal, or the publics under the story of the signal? We're closing the file with 3 careful notes that matter for later cases. First, at least one verifiable fact anchors the Psychotronics dossier, the 1970s high level commission and its published report acknowledging phenomena while admitting unknown mechanisms. Second, a bizarre durable detail persists: the Lida Auditorium Imagaz, a mnemonic artifact bridging therapy and control. Third, an open question refuses to settle whether acoustic psychocorrection or related methods ever achieved robust, repeatable effects beyond suggestive cases and selective testimonials. The broader human pattern becomes visible. Under stress, institutions gravitate toward technologies that promise influence without confrontation. And under secrecy, those promises inflate as they pass through rumor, speculation, and fear. In that sense, the silent hum of psychotronic generators is as much a social frequency as an electromagnetic one, tuning attention toward the possibility that thought itself could be a battle space, which is enough to change behavior before any device is switched on. But the real question remained: when minds begin acting as if influence is already in the air, does the tool need to work to achieve its purpose, or has the narrative already done the job it was built to do? You are sitting at a handmade listening post in an old bunker on a hill outside Turin. Fingers on a bakelite dial as a signal wavers into coherence, and the first thing that lands is not a word but a heartbeat, human rhythm translated into radio. And then a voice that sounds like someone reading the horizon out loud, while the horizon moves away too fast to follow. The verifiable anchor in this maze is stark. Official Soviet and later Russian histories list the human losses of their early space era as Vladimir Komarov. On Soyuz 1 in 1967 and the crew of Soyuz 11 in 1971, along with ground fatalities such as Valentin Bondarenko during a 1961 training chamber fire with no confirmed deaths in space before Gagarin's public flight on April 12, 1961. The enduring counterstory begins with Achille and Giovanni Battista Giudico Cordiglia, Italian amateur radio operators who claimed, from their Torbert listening station, to have recorded multiple emergency transmissions from secret Soviet missions between 1960 and 1964, including a Morse SOS fading into deep space and the crackling final words of an unnamed female cosmonaut during re-entry. But the real question remained. If the archives opened after the Cold War never revealed such missions, what exactly did those brothers capture or construct in nights when the sky felt close enough to touch? You are cross-checking timelines with the steadiness of a systems engineer, and the discipline clarifies even as uncertainty continues to hum. Soyuz. One launched on April 23, 1967, suffered control system failures, and ended with Komarov's fatal crash after a tangled main parachute failed to deploy, a tragedy. Detailed in multiple engineering accounts and official retrospectives, Soyuz 11 launched in 1971, achieved the first occupancy of a space station by docking to Salyut 1, then returned to Earth with 3 lifeless astronauts due to an inadvertently opened pressure equalization valve during module separation, making them the only humans confirmed to have died in space. Asphyxiated in less than a minute after rapid decompression, Bondarenko's death, concealed until 1986, occurred on March 23, 1961, when an oxygen-rich pressure chamber fire inflicted burns that proved fatal, a grim detail that shows the Soviets did hide accidents, but of a type consistent with ground training rather than orbital misadventures. But the real question remained: do these documented tragedies, once secret but now acknowledged, argue for a pattern of total concealment, or for a selective, eventually permeable secrecy that would have struggled to bury an entire crewed launch and loss? You are replaying the Torbert tapes through a historian's filter, and the anomalies multiply where romance meets radio. The brothers' release sequences, they dated to May and November 1960. February 1961, May 1961, October 1961, November 1962, May 1963, in April 1964, claiming to log a capsule veering off course. An SOS whose Doppler shift implied escape velocity, a suffocation. In the alleged last transmission of an unnamed female during fiery re-entry, skeptics note that some claimed events would imply launch activity that Western tracking and post-Soviet records do not corroborate. While linguistic experts point out that the brothers initially did not speak Russian and relied on ad hoc translations, a setup ripe for error or embellishment under the thrill of discovery, space journalists like James Oberg have argued that no independent data confirms the alleged missions, and that aspects of the brothers' broader claims, including eavesdropping on Mercury 6, strain plausibility given orbital mechanics, antenna gain, and signal path considerations. But the real question remained: when a narrative depends on recordings that cannot be chained to telemetry logs, launch windows, or third-party stations, how much weight can memory and motive bear without structural supports? You are feeling the psychological contour of the era. Two superpowers racing to place a human in orbit creates a pressure system that rewards spectacle and punishes failure. And in such weather, secrecy is not merely policy, but reflex. The Soviet program demonstrably concealed Bondarenko's death for nearly 2 decades, and they managed information tightly around catastrophes like the Nedelin rocket explosion in 1960, facts that feed the plausibility of deeper concealments even as they do not prove them. After 1991, however, a great deal of documentation, memoir, and technical review emerged, enumerating missions, crews, and failures in granular detail, from Vostok through the first Soyuz, without revealing corroborating evidence of pre-Gagarin or early 1960s, 8 crewed flights beyond those acknowledged, suggesting that systemic silence had boundaries shaped by bureaucratic record-keeping and institutional pride. This mixtural secrecy, real disclosures, persistent gaps acts like a prism that casts the same light into multiple colors depending on the angle of approach, which is why the Torbert recordings can be both irresistible and unmoored in the same breath. But the real question remained: in a system that archived everything to manage itself, could an entire human mission vanish without leaving even a bureaucratic silhouette. You are sketching the mundane details that tether this story to Earth because precision disciplines belief. Gagarin's calcined Keter crackled across Vostok 1. A detail widely documented and cross-checked with ground transcripts, while later crews used call signs like Rubin and Yantor, forming a nomenclature lattice that collectors and historians trace meticulously. By contrast, the alleged female cosmonaut's final words in the Judica Cordiglia catalog have no matching cal sign, no ground station transcript, and no coincident tracking data from recognized observatories, creating a vacuum where interpretation must stand in for collaboration. Meanwhile, the Soviets' official cosmonaut corps, lists, and biographies now include withdrawn candidates, medical scrub-outs, and reserve crew rotations. The sort of administrative sediment that would normally reveal unusual patterns around a hidden mission, but instead reads as prosaic and complete in the eras relevant to the alleged tapes. The real question remained: do ordinary, messy rosters speak more loudly than extraordinary? Perfectly dramatic recordings when adjudicating what truly happened in the sky. You are walking along a frost-silvered test track where the ground looks less like Earth than a memory of it, churned and compacted into something that behaves like the aftermath of a blast. And in the center of this controlled ruin sits a machine shaped as if its designers sculpted the wind itself, Object 279. The 4-tracked heavy tank built to stand upright in the age of overpressure and firestorms. The verifiable fact is direct and cold to the touch. Object 279 was constructed as a late 1950s experimental breakthrough tank with an ovoid, all-cast armored hull and a unique 4-track running gear intended to reduce ground pressure and resist overturning from nuclear blast shockwaves, an explicit accommodation to tactical nuclear use on the battlefield. Its silhouette was not a flourish, but a function, with heavily sloped, boat-like sides and a low center of gravity, to meet two predictable adversary-shaped charged jets in hurricane-force blast. Winds and the specification coupled this body to a 130mm gun, and advanced fire control for the period. A coherent statement of survival and lethality in one steel sentence. Even now, the pressure of proof rests in a single iron survivor at Kobinka, the tank museum west of Moscow, where unique prototypes keep their long vigil, and where this particular artifact, its existence, testifies against any claim that it was a rumor rather than a reality. But the real question remained: if the geometry was that eloquent and the use case that grimly plausible, why did the program end as a footnote in a museum placard rather than a lineage stamped across regimental history? You are reading the bureaucracy in the bevels, and one phrase stands out like a faint watermark beneath the paint. Timing kills as surely as any shaped charge, and Object 279 arrived in the exact political weather least suited to its survival. By 1960, Nikita Khrushchev's insistence on rockets and anti-tank guided missiles recalibrated Soviet doctrine away from colossal heavy tanks, leading to cancellations across the heavy category and redirecting effort toward lighter, more versatile main battle tanks and missile-centric solutions, a doctrinal pivot that stranded even successful heavy prototypes. The 4-track innovation solved a specific problem: mobility on churned or swampy terrain and resistance to flipping under blast, yet it imposed maintenance complexity and logistics burdens that were difficult to justify once policy no longer privileged heavy armor as the path to breakthrough. In that light, the decision reads less like a technical verdict than an ideological one. A choice about what future to pay for, and what story about survivability to tell to the officer corps and the factory floor alike. But the real question remained: do institutions announce such choices as strategy, or let the decommissioning notice speak for them while the prototypes fall silent in sheds? You are crouching beside the suspension to trace the way the tracks carry weight, and the details speak in numbers that feel like incantations. Each digit a promise against mud and blast, for continuous tracks spreading a nearly 6-ton mass hydropneumatic suspension to lower the profile when needed, and a form factor that made the ground itself complicit in keeping the turret level when the air turned into a hammer. Public-facing descriptions emphasize that this distribution of load reduced ground pressure, allowing the machine to traverse terrain. It would break the ankles of conventional vehicles, an ecological adaptation to the battlefield that anticipated not just weapons, but the weather of shock and dust and heat. Video from Kobinka in recent years has even shown the prototype coaxed back to motion, brief demonstration that converts museum stillness into mechanical testimony, and gives weight to claims about its mobility by rolling the argument on its own feet. If the bizarre had to be named, it is this: a tank that looks like a disc to cheat the wind, a machine that wears its aerodynamics like armor, a marriage of armor theory and blast physics, that feels less like a weapon than a thought experiment made steel. But the real question remained: when a solution is this visually singular, does it become too easy to dismiss as an oddity rather than to assess on the merits of its math? You are following the thread into the vault, where designations read like ciphers and a peculiar truth about Soviet nomenclature becomes a character in the story, the Obiekt. Numbering system acts as a semi-secret taxonomy, a ledger of prototypes whose numbers reveal kinships that their public profiles never did. Obiekt 277 and Obiekt 770 shared era and conceptual blood, with 279 each. Different answer to the same question about shock, firepower, and mass. And the three together illustrate a competitive approach to requirements that only a few years later would be rendered academically interesting by one decree and a leader's desire to see missiles in every corner. This is the quirky detail that doubles as an unsolved cipher. A culture of object numbers whispering across decades where the formal story denies continuity, and where enthusiasts and historians reconstruct lineages like codebreakers reconstruct keys from partial intercepts. The cipher does not reveal a conspiracy, only a methodical way of indexing ambition under a system that assumes secrecy first and recognition later, if ever. But the real question remained: how many other objects performed their duty to a requirement that expired before a factory line could be born, and what does that say about the half-life of military ideas when politics accelerates their decay? You are considering the psychology of a machine that prepares to fight in a world most strategists prefer not to imagine. And the human element clarifies why such designs vanish by choice rather than by accident. To keep a concept alive, an army must rehearse its nightmare often enough that it becomes doctrine, and some nightmares resist rehearsal. The nuclearized battlefield conjures tactical decisions that flow like liquid smoke. Heat, shock, dust, requiring vehicles and crews to accept that survival is a function of geometry as much as armor plate, and Obiekt 279 is geometry turned into doctrine, a confession that the shockwave is as real a weapon as the shell. When doctrine recedes from that edge, the hardware feels like a rebuke to the new optimism, or a distraction from the new fashion. And the easiest resolution is to enshrine it as an artifact, rather than to argue with a machine in front of a budget committee. This is how certain technologies vanish. They are not discredited. They are retired from the conversation, parked where their presence can be honored without becoming persuasive. But the real question remained: who gets to choose whether a prototype S-lesson is a relic S-lesson or an ancestor S-lesson? And on what timeline do those choices get reviewed when the weather of war changes again? You are back at the museum barrier, where a child presses a hand to the glass exactly where the armor curve bulges like the rind of some pressure-hardened fruit. And the docent S script carries one last prosaic anchor. This is the only surviving Obiekt 279 anyone can point to. And it lives here because the archive preferred a single exemplar to a line of successors. The exhibit label ties the machine to its designer and its moment, situating it among other orphans of doctrinal pivots, the Maus hulking in German steel nearby. The Su-152 Terran in Soviet angles each, a monument to questions that grew old faster than their answers. The absurd detail, beloved by hobbyists, is that even within the enthusiast community, the tank continues to slip between reality and simulation. Its specifications a palimpsest where game stats and museum measurements occasionally blur. A modern echo of the way rumor and record always tangle when the subject was born classified. The ledger entry remains correct, though, for tracks, ovoid hull, built for shock, cancelled by policy, preserved by curators, and occasionally stirred to life to remind that some idea is idle for decades without stalling. But the real question remained: when the future that cancelled a machine has itself been cancelled by a newer future, what prevents the argument it embodied from returning, not as nostalgia, but as necessity? You are standing on a salt-bitten plain at the edge of Lake Bakash, where concrete hulks squat like abandoned chess pieces in the air. Carries the faint metallic smell of a test range that once tried to turn light into leverage, a place named in spare TypeScript as Terra 3 on the Surrey Shagan, Anti-ballistic missile testing ground in Kazakhstan. The verifiable anchor is uncomplicated and stubborn. This was a Soviet laser testing center repurposed from grander missile defense ambitions after the 1972 Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, ultimately hosting a visible ruby laser installed in 1979 and an infrared carbon dioxide laser added in 1982. Both used mostly for tracking experiments rather than for burning holes into the sky. You are reading the range's own biography etched in dated plaques and declassified summaries. 480 kilometers of instrumentation corridor, first authorized in 1956, a place that struck a ballistic warhead in 1961, an experimental interceptor, and later earned decorations for doing what test ranges do, which is to turn hypotheses into telemetry and leave the poetry to someone else. Yet the words that gather here are not only technical. They are theatrical, because the very idea of a laser range turns imaginations into sensors long before the optics align, and that drama is part of what keeps the sight bright in memory, even as its equipment dims. You are following a thread that loops between doctrine and rumor. During the 1980s, public statements from parts of the U.S. defense establishment hinted at a looming Soviet advantage in directed energy, a laser gap that echoed earlier missile gap rhetoric. While internal CIA assessments reportedly offered cooler appraisals of Terra 3's actual capability, creating an interagency chiaroscuro that was as political as it was technical, the Strategic Defense Initiative heated this atmosphere by promising a different kind of sky. And in that heat, Sergei Shagin's lasers acquired a silhouette larger than their power budgets could justify. A projection that deterrence sometimes cultivates because shadows scale more cheaply than systems do. The result was a narrative that let a research complex wear the mask of an operational weapon. It's not because the optics warranted it, but because public positioning made that mask useful for budgets. Messaging and bargaining across the table of perception. In this dance, Terra 3 became a character in a broader play about whether beams could replace boost phase intercepts, and whether images could do the work of inventory. You are inspecting the hardware with a sober eye. The measurements say something the myths cannot contradict. When a U.S. delegation visited in July 1989 under the late Glasnost thaw, they found a facility whose lasers were orders of magnitude less powerful than U.S. testbeds like MIRACL with small focusing. Optics and an uncooled director that would never have handled sustained high-energy output evidence that the site had not progressed to an operational anti-satellite capability. The visitors reported systems geared toward tracking and sensor experiments fitting aircraft with detectors to confirm pointing. It's attempting to illuminate passing satellites, not to blind them decisively, but to understand the boundary between detectable and decisive, line that physics and atmosphere draw together. Even in disappointment, those notes matter because they convert rumor into geometry and convert posture into power budgets, the currencies that technical cultures trust over stories told at podiums. The facility was already on the slope toward abandonment and partial disassembly. Not because lasers were fantasy, but because this particular combination of power, control, and propagation didn't cash out as a weapon at that place and that time. You are turning now to a single rumor that refuses to retire. On October 10th, 1984. The story goes, Terra 3 illuminated Space Shuttle Challenger at low power during STS-41G, causing malfunctions and crew distress, prompting a U.S. diplomatic protest and a quiet decision to cease such tracking, a tale often traced to former Soviet officials and repeated across decades with the durability of a campfire ghost. Analysts note that shuttle crew members and knowledgeable members of the U.S. intelligence community have denied that Terra 3 actually illuminated the orbiter, and that later inspection showed the site lacked the pointing precision and laser power to meaningfully affect a spacecraft. At hundreds of kilometers, slant-range details that turn sensational claims into a lesson about how far a beam has to travel to become a myth. The persistence of the anecdote proves something, even if the technical claim does not. That in an age of classified demonstrations, a soft-spoken phrase, laser tracking, can be heard as an attack by audiences primed for drama, and that misunderstanding can become a strategic asset all by itself. This is the social physics of directed energy. Photons scatter, stories amplify. And sometimes the latter deposits more energy into decision-making than the former ever could into a target. You are cataloging one verifiable flavor of activity, that Terra 3. Likely did attempt sensor dazzling at low levels and tracking practice, which remains a far cry from blinding satellites. Because blinding implies both sufficient irradiance at the sensor and sufficient dwell time across jitter, pointing error, and atmospheric turbulence. A cascade of requirements that the 1989 inspection suggested had not been met at this complex. The Surrey-Shagan range itself as a larger enterprise stayed vital beyond any single building continuing to host. ABM system tests, radar experiments, and interceptor launches into the 21st century A. Continuity that underscores how test ranges outlive fashions in physics and serve whatever wave of development the state chooses next. That institutional durability is the unsung protagonist of the story because it explains how a site can let one technology go dark while another flickers to life. Down the road, a choreography of concrete and cabling that keeps the national laboratory alive even as individual programs fold. In the ledger of vanishing, this matters. Sometimes the disappearance is a matter of room assignments, not a funeral. We're obliged for the sake of the bizarre to note a detail that reads like pulp but appeared in sober venues. The Soviets reportedly developed a laser pistol, and even a laser revolver concept in the mid-1980s. Devices intended to damage optics or dazzle hostile astronauts without hull penetration. An anecdote invoked to illustrate the breadth of directed energy ambition at the time, even if such sidearms sound more like props than production. Whether or not such weapons were anything more than demonstrations, their mention turns attention to a truth. Often missed in top-level discussions, directed energy was explored across scales and missions. From laboratory benches to imagined extravehicular spats, because the technology's seduction lies in its promise of codeless control. Number ballistics, no recoil, just line of sight and will. This is the cipher of Terra 3S. Ecosystem, a spectrum of projects where what links them is not maturity but a shared narrative that light itself could be made into. Policy, and that belief persisted, even when beam quality and power sources lagged behind the politics. If that sounds like a riddle, it is. And every time it is retold, the riddle solves the teller more than the tech. You are folding the practical into the political. The ABM Treaty narrowed the aperture for open pursuit of missile defense lasers on the ground repurposing Terra 3 into a more modest platform under Vimpel and Astrophysica's stewardship, a move that channeled ambition into experiments rather than deployments, and thus set expectations that later history judged fairly. When the Cold War's temperature dropped, a rare July 1989 on-site inspection poured water on overheated claims, and the post-Soviet era turned the facility into a partial ruin, where tour groups and analysts point at corroded mounts and speak in past tense about what was once a future tense. Today, the range remains active in other guises tests of interceptors for systems like the A135, A235 family and radar work, while the Terra 3 name survives mainly as shorthand for a chapter in the long argument about whether light will ever join metal as the decisive grammar of defense. In that sense, decommissioning is less an erasure than an editorial decision, a choice about which sentences to keep reading aloud. You are attentive to the psychology that explains why Terra 3 seems to vanish and reappear depending on who tells the story. For those who needed a Soviet foil to justify American investment, it loomed. For those who needed a Soviet success to justify their own budgets, it glowed. For inspectors with clipboards and watt meters, it underperformed. For historians, it became a case study in how narratives can be engineered as carefully as optical benches. The documented facts keep their shape: 1979 and 1982 laser installations, low-power tracking. 1989 inspection, partial dismantlement, but the surrounding aura refuses to yield. Because directed energy attracts metaphors as readily as it attracts electrons, and metaphors are hard to decommission. This is why the site S blind spot has two meanings. One technical, the inability to hold a damaging spot on a distant, fast-moving, hardened sensor, and one cognitive, the tendency for observers to see either too much or nothing at all when secrecy and science overlap. Both kinds of blindness are survivable, but both can steer policy harder than data does when the room is dark and the map is a rumor. You are closing the Terra 3 folder with 3 pins to keep the page from lifting in the archival breeze. First, a verifiable historical fact anchors every retelling. The July 1989 U.S. visit documented that Terra 3's lasers were prototypes far below weapon class power and the site has since been abandoned and partly disassembled as a directed energy locus, even while Surrey Shagan endures for other missions. Second, a quirky detail lingers like a fingerprint on the lens the reported Soviet laser pistol and revolver concepts. More emblem than arsenal, whose very implausibility helps explain why directed energy invites theater alongside testing. Third, an open question invites listeners to stay skeptical without going blind. But the real question remained if low-power tracking and sensor experiments were achieved. What lessons and datasets migrated into darker compartments, where classification preserves not just capability, but ambiguity? Ensuring that the clearest signals remain just out of public sight, you are flying low over a smoky Siberian tree line, where contrails stitch pale scars across convective towers, and the radio is calm as a pilot reads coordinates for another pass, because the goal is not drama, but timing seed the right cloud at the right altitude with the right nuclei, for the wind decides otherwise, which is how a very human routine becomes mistaken for a machine that controls the sky. The verifiable anchor is clear and well documented. The Soviet Union built one of the world's largest weather modification enterprises, establishing, by 1958, a routine procedure to clear airports of fog and low clouds through cloud seeding while expanding parallel programs to increase rainfall and suppress hail for agriculture. Using aircraft ground generators, rockets, balloons, and even tracer bullets to deliver reagents like dry ice silver iodide, and lead iodide into specific cloud structures. In that operational grammar, the spectacular hides inside the mundane, weather technicians checking lapse rates, dispatchers coordinating sorties, and radar operators watching reflectivity bloom in precisely the way that convinces a budget committee more reliably than any legend can. The psychology of power adds a shadow, though, because routine control over nuisance weather fog at an airfield, hail over vineyards sounds to the unbriefed ear like the opening sentence of a far larger capability. And ambiguity does the rest. You are seated at a maintenance bay beside a specialized Antonov, a survey plane that in Russian hands has worn a different vocation and an unsettling nickname, the AN-30M Sky Cleaner. Outfitted with internal solid carbon dioxide containers and external meteorological cartridges to seed or scour clouds on command. A platform designed not to conjure rain from nothing, but to nudge marginal clouds over the threshold where physics is already leaning. In recent years, this same logic scaled into highly visible civic rituals and emergency responses, with government contracts, funding flights to disperse clouds and force rain ahead of parades and public holidays, and emergency deployments in 2020 to help fight Siberian forest fires by encouraging precipitation where conditions allowed, while parallel operations attempted to relieve drought conditions over Crimea with targeted seeding sorties. From the ground, it can look like magic jets outline the sky, rain falls where officials point, but the mechanism is not a wand. It is nucleation, physics, and probabilities pushed by pilotage and payloads against a chaotic boundary where success is real and variable. But the real question remained: when visible control is exercised for civic theater, how many observers will infer invisible control over storms that obey no contract? And what responsibilities attach to managing that inference across borders and publics? You are standing now in Tomsk at a campus whose instruments watch rather than command. And the signage spells out a different kind of authority. The V-Zuv Institute of Atmospheric Optics of the Siberian branch of the Russian Academy of Sciences, founded in 1969, which built a Siberian LiDAR station, aerosol observatories, and a Torgas network to measure the atmosphere as fine structure and composition over vast distances and time. Institute's laboratories collect satellite and in situ data on aerosols. Kada when I predict tackle said I would read that atmospheric and oceanic optics and support a flying lab and field missions that turn Siberia into an instrumented volume, rather than a blank on the map, a fact that anchors any serious discussion of weather machines in the bedrock of observation, and an irony that explains many legends, the more comprehensive the monitoring infrastructure, the easier it is for outsiders to mistake a measurement network for a control network, especially when the acronyms are dense and the optics' literal lasers point skyward. The mundane truth is that diagnostics precede therapy in atmospheric science, and Siberia's optical bench is built first to know, not to command. You are tilting the map westward because myths travel faster than coordinates, and one Russian facility in particular has become a magnet for narratives that slide from weather into climate and from measurement into manipulation. The Sura ionospheric heating facility near Vasil-Sursk, commissioned in 1981, and capable of effective radiated powers measured in the hundreds of megawatts across, 4.5 to 9.3 megahertz, built to study how high-frequency transmissions heat and perturb the ionosphere, and to explore how modulated currents in that plasma might generate low-frequency emissions. Sura is not in Siberia, and it is not a weather machine. But its existence and its frequent comparison to the later American HARP feeds, a broader public category of sky heaters that gets misfiled under weather control whenever the public vocabulary collapses the ionosphere, the troposphere, and the word atmosphere into one thing that answers two levers and switches. Russian and international teams have used Sura for experiments that leave measurable signatures, including 2018 joint campaigns with China SCSES Jiangguan satellite that detected localized ionospheric perturbations during specific heating cycles, results that are technically interesting and socially radioactive. Because we changed something in the sky is a phrase that refuses to stay modest once it leaves a laboratory. The technical literature underscores that such perturbations live far above weather. But the public ear rarely keeps those layers separate when fear or fascination is doing the sorting. You are flipping through a policy file that explains why the line between influence and control is always under negotiation. And the Soviet Turishin record offers both scale and restraint in the same ledger. A CIA survey from the Cold War era assessed Soviet weather modification as larger than comparable U.S. efforts, but slightly inferior in quality, noting both sound proposals like hail overseeding and acknowledged uncertainties in precipitation enhancement. A balance that speaks more to scientific caution than to secret mastery. Encyclopedic surveys match this texture, pointing to robust anti-hail programs across Russia and former Soviet republics, where insurers, vintners, and regional authorities fund aircraft and ground generators to reduce damage, a practice that is public regulated and unsurprising wherever hail writes balance sheets in jagged numbers each summer. In parallel, the global literature on cloud seeding remains mixed on effect sizes with variability across geography and method, reminding that weather modification machine is a romantic label for a stochastic intervention, always at the mercy of ambient dynamics and error bars. The cognitive trap is to let scale impersonate certainty, which institutions combat by publishing methods and results rather than slogans, even when headlines are cheaper than peer review. You are obliged to note a quirky, durable detail that keeps this chapter in the orbit of the uncanny. Russian language sources and summaries have referenced a weather electromagnetic correction, technology discussed in a 2015 review and traced to 1980s era. USSR work a phrase that sits neatly between ionospheric heating and cloud seeding in the public imagination, while refusing to resolve into a consensus technique in the open literature. The very wording performs like a cipher broad enough to suggest field effects, narrow enough to sound authenticated, and conveniently situated at the crossover where defense budgets and civil agencies could both claim jurisdiction without promising outcomes beyond influence, a word built to live indoors. It pairs rhetorically with the Sky Cleaner nickname, a branding flourish that no sober meteorologist would choose, but that every storyteller will repeat. Because names like that fold uncertainty into implication, with less effort than a proper methods section could ever require. In the dramaturgy of classified historical information, ciphers like these do not solve, they circulate. Keeping attention warm while evidence stays cool. You are tracing consequences because whether work leaks across borders by design in Russia. His contemporary use of seeding to force. Rain before parades poses the same ethical question that anti-hail networks have raised for decades. Who owns the rain? The city that schedules it early? The farm that loses it later? Or the watershed that never consented to time-shifting precipitation within its bounds? Siberia's 2020 deployments for wildfire mitigation add another layer, because emergency seeding pits immediate public safety against the long arithmetic of hydrology, raising the possibility that winds today move losses to a different day, place, or sector unless the monitoring and modeling are equal to the intervention. This is where Tomsk's optics, Moscow's contracts, and vassal Sursk's heater accidentally collaborate in the public mind to create the silhouette of a singular machine. When in reality the only machine in sight is an administrative apparatus that coordinates limited physical nudges under law, budget, and increasingly unforgiving climate variance. But the real question remained. In a century when meteorology is weaponized by rhetoric as much as by reagents, can institutions earn trust by publishing enough method and data to make the machine look like the toolbox it really is? We're closing the folder with 3 anchors to keep this story on bearings when the weather turns dramatic again. First, a verifiable historical fact: by 1958, the USSR operated routine fog dispersal seeding at airports and pursued hail suppression and rainfall enhancement with aircraft and rockets demonstrates scale without implying sorcery. Second, a quirky detail: the AN30M Sky Cleaner nickname and the 2015 electromagnetic correction phrasing shows how language can magnify modest techniques into talismans of control in the public square. Third, an open question refuses to settle. But the real question remained: if Russia's Siberian research hubs perfect the art of seeing the sky's microstructure while its fleets continue to nudge marginal clouds and its ionospheric lab keeps heating plasma far above weather, where should scientists, policymakers, and neighbors draw the line between acceptable influence, unacceptable externality, and the illusions that thrive in the space between them? You are descending through the green-filtered light of the Black Sea, your dive lamp cutting a cone through the hazy water column, toward a shape that resolves into corroded metal and thick-paned glasses, submerged room resting on the seabed, a forgotten outpost from an era that dreamed of colonizing the deep. The verifiable fact that anchors this exploration is not a single sunken city, but a documented progression of Soviet underwater habitats. A story that begins not with state decrees but with the grassroots enthusiasm of a Donetsk diving club in the 1960s, inspired by the West's Jacques Cousteau and his Kunshelf habitats. These amateurs named their club Ichthyonder after the amphibian man from a Soviet sci-fi novel, and proceeded to build the USSR's first underwater house, from what amounted to scrap metal and sheer will, lowering it into the waters off Crimea in 1966. This was not a state secret, it was a public spectacle of ingenuity. A demonstration that the frontier of undersea living could be pushed by volunteers armed with rust-proof enthusiasm and a desire to see what was down there. Their logs speak of crabs crawling over portholes and the glow of bioluminescent microorganisms. A human-scale encounter with an alien world that set the stage for more official ambitions to follow. You are reading the transition from club to state in the design of later machines, which traded amateur charm for military-grade purpose. As the 1970s progressed, the Soviet Navy and research institutes took over, developing more sophisticated tethered diving chambers and submersibles for research, salvage, and strategic advantage. Declassified reports from both Soviet and Western sources describe these habitats as functional if not luxurious. Pressurized cylinders with viewing ports, external manipulators, and life support systems designed to allow aquanauts to live and work at depth for days or weeks, acclimating to the pressure to extend their operational range on the seafloor. These were not cities, but they were the suburbs of a larger strategic vision. The Black Sea was the primary theater for the Soviet Black Sea Fleet. A body of water dense with naval traffic, submarine patrols, and acoustic surveillance networks like SOSUS, which listened for the quiet hum of enemy boats. In this context, An underwater habitat was more than a lab. It was a potential listening post, a covert sortie base, or a repair station. A way to put human eyes and hands on the seabed in a region saturated with geopolitical tension. You are swimming along the coast to Balaclava Bay in Crimea, where the logic of underwater presence takes its most extreme form, a decommissioned, top-secret submarine base tunneled directly into the mountainside. And living quarters with enough resources to sustain 1,500 personnel for up to 30 days in the event of an attack. While not a submersible city in the sense of being permanently underwater, the Balaclava base represents the ultimate expression of the same strategic impulse. To hide critical military infrastructure beneath a protective layer in this case. Hundreds of feet of rock instead of water ensure operational continuity even after the world above has ended. The base was so secret that Balaclava itself was a closed city for decades. Eventual transformation into a museum in 2003 is the final act of declassification for a place built to be erased from maps. The existence of such a hardened, hidden naval installation provides a crucial psychological insight. The Soviet system was willing to invest immense resources to create deniable, survivable outposts, making the idea of smaller, less grandiose underwater labs vanishing from the record entirely plausible. But the real question remained. If a base this monumental could be kept secret for so long, how many smaller experimental habitats were deployed, tested, and then simply left on the seafloor when their funding or purpose expired? You are hovering now over a different kind of submerged landscape, Zernov's Philophora Field. A unique ecosystem in the northwestern Black Sea where vast meadows of red seaweed create a habitat for dozens of species, most of them also shaded red for camouflage. This natural underwater city, discovered by a Russian scientist in 1909, serves as a poignant counterpoint to the man-made habitats. It is a reminder that the Black Sea has always hosted complex, hidden worlds, long before the first aquanaut descended. The sea is a palimpsest. Ancient Greek port cities like Accra lie sunken near the Kerch Strait, their stone walls and amphorae preserved by the very water that drowned them, telling a story of maritime societies thousands of years old. The Soviet habitats are merely the most recent layer. Their abandonment is not unique. It is part of a longer history of things vanishing beneath the waves. The quirky, bizarre detail that lingers is the image from the first Ichshinder log. A crab named Mitka, phlegmatically chewing on something just outside the porthole. It reveals the human need to domesticate the alien, to make a home in a place that is fundamentally hostile, a drive that powered both the amateur clubs and the vast military projects. You are coating the evidence, and a pattern of vanishing emerges that is less about a single shocking event and more about slow, administrative decay and the overwhelming scale of the sea itself. The early amateur habitats like Ichthyinder were poorly documented by nature. Later, more official projects would have been subject to military classification, their records buried in archives that may or may not have survived the dissolution of the USSR. And finally, the sea itself is a powerful agent of erasure. Metal corrodes, structures are buried by sediment, and the location of a small experimental outpost can be easily lost without consistent maintenance and marking. The submersible cities did not vanish in a dramatic implosion. They likely faded away, one by one, as budgets were cut, programs were canceled, and the strategic rationale shifted. They became another set of anomalous sonar contacts on the seafloor, their original purpose forgotten. They are ghosts not because they were destroyed, but because they were abandoned and the paperwork was lost. But the real question remained, as modern conflicts pollute these waters and change the very chemistry of the Black Sea. Are we losing the last faint traces of these underwater outposts before their full story can ever be told?
You are standing on a dusty, crater-pocked field under a grey sky, your boots kicking up fine dark soil that was graded, raked and sculpted to mimic a place you will never go. This is the Lunodrome, the Moondrome, a 1-hectare simulation of the lunar surface built in the 1960s in a closed Crimean town, a training ground where remote control drivers learned to navigate a world they could only see through a screen. You are walking through an abandoned dream, a stage set for a play that closed after only 2 acts, and in a quiet museum hall near Moscow, the star of the unperformed 3rd act sits under gallery lights, a machine built for a journey it never took. Lunocod 3. The verifiable fact is crisp and administrative. The rover, vehicle number 205, was fully manufactured and prepared for a 1977 lunar mission aboard a spacecraft designated Luna 25, but the mission was cancelled due to a lack of both funding and available Proton launch vehicles. This is not a disappearance into shadow. It is a vanishing into a ledger, a lineatum vitae that turned a functional cutting-edge explorer into a permanent terrestrial artifact. You are looking at the rover's schematics, and they tell a story of remarkable success born from a colossal failure. The Lunocod program was originally conceived to support the Soviet crewed lunar landing effort, the N1L3 program. The rovers were meant to be robotic scouts, reconnoitering landing sites for cosmonauts and acting as homing beacons for their landers. But when the gargantuan N1 rocket failed repeatedly and the race to the moon was lost, the Soviet space program pivoted. The Lunocods were repurposed from support crew to main characters. In November 1970, Lunocod 1 rolled down the ramp of its Luna 17 lander and became the first remote-controlled robotic vehicle to explore another world, operating for 11 months far beyond its 3-month design life. It sent back over 20,000 images and performed hundreds of soil analyses, a stunning success. In 1973, Lunocod 2 repeated the feat, covering even more ground before a fatal driving error cooked its electronics. These were triumphs of engineering and telerobotics, achievements that stood on their own merit. And Lunocod 3 was designed to be the next logical step, an evolution of a proven system. Its mission was not a fantasy, it was scheduled. You are examining the psychology of a program that succeeds brilliantly, just as its parent's ambitions die. The cancellation of Lunocod 3 was not a technical judgment, it was a political and economic one. With the crewed lunar program officially dead, and with America's Apollo program winding down by 1972, and NASA turning off its own lunar surface instruments in 1977, the political impetus for expensive lunar missions evaporated. The focus of the Soviet space program shifted to long-duration space stations in Earth orbit, like the Soyuz program, which promised more immediate returns in science and prestige. In this new climate, a 3rd lunar rover mission, no matter how scientifically valuable, was deemed a luxury. The program vanished not because it failed, but because it had become an orphan. The decision-makers chose to invest in a different future, and Lunocod 3 was parked, a perfect machine with no place to go. its mission profile gathering dust alongside its chassis. This is one of the quietest, most bureaucratic forms of technological disappearance, death by irrelevance. But the real question remained: when a nation builds a machine capable of exploring another world, and then chooses to keep it in a garage, what does that say about the relationship between capability and will? You are back at the Lunodrome, where 54 craters and 160 scattered rocks were used to simulate the treacherous lunar terrain for the remote control teams. This artificial moonscape is the bizarre, quirky detail that perfectly encapsulates the story. It is a tangible, earthbound monument to an extraterrestrial ambition. Here, in this closed military town, drivers sat in control rooms staring at low-resolution television screens, practicing maneuvers with a significant time delay, learning the feel of a machine 250,000 miles away. The rover was not a true robot. It was a puppet, and the 5-person crew commander, driver, navigator, radio operator, and flight engineer were the puppeteers. This human-in-the-loop system is the story's secret cipher. It was this system that allowed Lunokhod 1 to navigate out of harm's way, and it was a moment of human error within this system that doomed Lunokhod 2. The crew, blinded by the sun behind them, drove into a crater. In the process of maneuvering out, they scooped lunar dust onto the rover's lid. When the lid was closed for the lunar night, that dust was dumped onto the radiator, destroying its ability to shed heat. The rover cooked itself on the following lunar day. The missing mission of Lunokhod 3 is therefore also the story of a team of trained drivers who never got to take their final test. You are considering the nature of this specific kind of vanishing. Unlike a secret weapon system that is deliberately hidden, Lunokhod 3 was hidden in plain sight, its existence never denied. It simply stopped moving forward. Its story wasn't erased. It was concluded with a period instead of an exclamation point. The technology didn't disappear, it was archived. This case provides a crucial model for understanding how progress in exploration is not a straight line. It is subject to the whims of budgets, political winds, and the ever-shifting definition of what is deemed important. Lunokhod 3 is a silent testament to the fact that sometimes the most advanced technologies are defeated not by physics or engineering challenges, but by a simple lack of interest from the people paying the bills. Its legacy is a thought experiment. What might it have discovered? What new questions would it have opened up? Its absence from the moon leaves a small, permanent void in the history of exploration. But the real question remained: how many other completed flight-ready spacecraft from all nations sit in storage facilities and museums, their missions cancelled for reasons that had nothing to do with their readiness to fly?
You are walking a quiet, dusty path on the outskirts of Kishtim, a town etched into the Ural Mountains, a place whose very soil holds the memory of a secret nuclear past. The air here has always carried stories, but in the summer of 1996, one of them took physical form. An elderly woman named Tamara Proverina, who lived with the ghosts of her own fragile mind, found something wrapped in a blanket near a well. It was a tiny living creature, no more than 25 centimeters long and in her loneliness, she named it Alyoshenka, her little Alexei, and took it home to be her child. The verifiable fact is that a body existed, was photographed, filmed, and handled by multiple people. This was not a rumor, but an artifact. It was a small, humanoid creature with a gray-brown body, an onion-shaped head with no discernible hair, and large, dark eyes that seemed to occupy most of its face. It reportedly had no ears, no visible genitals, and a mouth that was just a small, round hole. It was, by all accounts, a grotesque and pitiable thing. For a short time, it lived. Pravina fed it, swaddled it, and spoke to it as a mother would. Then, the inevitable hand of bureaucracy intervened. Pravarina was taken to a psychiatric hospital, and in her absence, with no one to care for it, Alyoshenka died. You are now in a small, cluttered apartment, the air thick with the smell of old paper and stale bread. A man, a friend of Pravarina's, has found the creature's body. To preserve it, he washes it with alcohol and lets it dry, creating a crude mummy. The story could have ended there, a private tragedy in a town full of them. But the man is arrested for stealing electrical cable, and in a desperate attempt to explain himself, or perhaps trade a curiosity for leniency, he shows the mummified body to the police. This is where the story shifts from folklore to a police procedural, albeit a bizarre one. The officer who takes charge of the case is Vladimir Bendlin. Faced with an object that fit no category, he did what any provincial policeman would do. He began an investigation. He took the mummy, which he stored for a time in his home refrigerator, and sought expert opinions, and here the narrative splits. A local pathologist declared it was not human. A gynecologist, Dr. Irina Yermoleva, insisted it was a human fetus. A premature baby with severe deformities, likely caused by the lingering radioactive contamination from the 1957 Kishtim nuclear disaster at the nearby Mayak plutonium plant. A clinical assistant, Lyubov Romanova, having seen countless birth defects, stated she had never seen anything like it, pointing to the skull's strange four-bone structure as proof it was not human. In this confusion, Bendlin made a fateful decision. He handed Alyoshenka's body over to a group of visiting ufologists, who promised a full scientific analysis. They took the mummy, and it was never seen again. You are watching a piece of evidence vanish from the record, and with it, the possibility of certainty. The disappearance of the body is the central act of this mystery. Without the specimen, there could be no definitive DNA testing, no final scientific verdict. The story was now permanently unmoored from fact and free to drift into legend. Timing was perfect. The late 1990s in Russia were a chaotic time, a vacuum of authority and belief that was quickly filled by mystics, charlatans, and alien hunters. Japanese documentary crews arrived in Kishtim, paying locals for interviews and turning a local tragedy into an international paranormal spectacle. The myth solidified. A star child had landed in the Urals, was cared for by a madwoman, and then after its death, its body was stolen, perhaps by the government to hide the truth, or perhaps by its own kind returning to collect their lost offspring. The story even acquired a tragic postscript. A few years after losing Alyoshenka to Mara, Pravarina was killed, hit by a truck late at night while reportedly dancing on the highway, a final sorrowful note that cemented her place as a martyr in the growing cult of the Kishtim dwarf. You were sitting in a genetics lab years later, looking at the data from a different, yet strikingly similar case. In 2003, another tiny humanoid skeleton was found in the Atacama Desert in Chile. It had the same elongated skull, the same strange bone structure. For years, it too was hailed as an alien. But in 2018, geneticists at Stanford University published a full analysis. The Atacama skeleton was humana, female fetus, with a host of previously unknown and severe genetic mutations related to bone development and dwarfism. This scientific conclusion provides the most powerful, transformative lens through which to view the story of Alyoshenka. The Kishtim dwarf was almost certainly not an alien. It was a human child, a victim of a cascade of genetic misprints so profound that it barely resembled a person. The radioactive legacy of the Mayak plant provides a plausible, though unproven, cause for such extreme mutations. The strange origins were not from another star, but from the poisoned earth of its own home. But the real question remained. If the body of Alyoshenka had been properly preserved and studied with the scientific truth, the story of a tragically deformed child from a contaminated land have been as compelling as the myth of the lost alien baby. The bizarre, quirky detail that becomes a cipher for the entire event is Officer Benlin keeping the mummy in his refrigerator. It's a moment of profound, almost comical surrealism. It grounds the otherworldly story in the most mundane of domestic appliances. A potential alien emissary, a unique biological specimen, a source of global fascination, spent its last days on Earth next to the milk and sausages. This single image captures the entire story, the collision of the extraordinary and the profoundly ordinary. The high drama of the unknown meeting, the low comedy of provincial bureaucracy. It is a reminder that history, even at its strangest, is always human. The open question is the one left by the vanishing. The ufologists who took the body were either frauds or fools, and in their hands, a unique opportunity for science was lost forever. But perhaps, in a psychological sense, the vanishing was necessary. It allowed the story to become a mirror. For those who saw a government cover-up, it reflected a deep-seated mistrust of authority. For those who saw an alien, it reflected a hope for meaning in a chaotic world. For scientists, it reflects the tragedy of lost data. Alyoshenka became whatever people needed it to be, precisely because it was no longer there. The vanishing was not an end to the story, but the act that allowed it to become eternal. You are walking on land that should not exist, a cracked, salt-caked expanse of desert, under a merciless sun, where the horizon shimmers with the ghost of a dead sea. This is Vosrostinia Island, a name that means rebirth, but you are standing in a graveyard. For decades, this was an island in the middle of the vast Aral Sea, one of the most isolated places on Earth, which is precisely why the Soviet military chose it in 1954 to build Aralsk. 7. Their premier open-air biological weapons testing ground. The verifiable fact is written in declassified documents and the testimony of defectors. Here, on this remote patch of land, scientists weaponized the apocalypse. They tested anthrax, smallpox, plague, tularemia, and Q fever, releasing them in aerosol clouds to drift over tethered animals, perfecting the art of turning life against itself. A secret town named Kantebek grew here, a self-contained world with barracks, labs, family apartments, and a school, a place where several hundred people lived and worked, their mundane lives unfolding against a backdrop of unimaginable horror. You are seeing not one, but two vanishings happen at once. The first was political. In the fall of 1991, as the Soviet Union was collapsing, the order came to abandon Aral Sezon. The military and scientific personnel packed up and left in a hurry, dismantling the labs and leaving the town of Kantubek to the wind and the sand. This was an abrupt desertion, power turning off the lights on its darkest secret as the entire building was about to be condemned. In April 1992, Russian President Boris Yeltsin officially ordered the shutdown of all offensive biological weapons programs, and the book was closed on Vosrostinia. The people vanished, the program vanished, but the pathogens remained. The second vanishing was ecological, and it had been happening for decades. The Soviet planners who diverted the two great rivers that fed the Aral Sea to irrigate cotton fields had signed its death warrant back in the 1960s. The sea began to shrink, its shoreline receding year after year. Vosrostinia Island, once a secure 200-square-kilometer fortress of water, grew larger as the sea around it turned to desert. By 2001, the island's southern edge had touched the mainland. The island itself had vanished, swallowed by the desert it was meant to be protected by. The natural prison wall had crumbled. You are standing now near a series of pits in the ground, and you feel a cold dread that has nothing to do with the desert heat. This is the site of the story's bizarre, cryptic heart. In 1988, just as the Soviet biological weapons program was facing increased international scrutiny, the scientists at Aral 7 received a strange order. They were to dispose of their massive stockpile of weaponized anthrax. They dug 11 large pits, poured in hundreds of tons of live anthrax slurry, a brown, viscous soup of dormant spores, and mixed it with bleach before burying it under layers of sand. This act is the story's cipher. It was a panicked, sloppy attempt at concealment, not safe disposal. They were burying a living monster in a shallow grave, hoping no one would ever come looking for it. The chilling irony is that they buried it on an island that, within a few short years, would no longer be an island. The secure location for their secret dump was about to become an open plain. It's accessible to anyone or anything that could walk across the newly exposed land bridge. The consequences of this dual vanishing were terrifyingly real. For years, the greatest fear was that rodents, having colonized the former island, would carry infected soil or fleas to the mainland, starting an epidemic. Or that scavengers, drawn to the abandoned town, would disturb the anthrax pits. This threat was so severe that in 2002, United States Department of Defense funded a $6 million expedition to the island. A team of American specialists, working with Uzbek authorities, spent months at the site, excavating the pits, testing the spores, and neutralizing the remaining anthrax with powerful chemicals. It was a quiet, dangerous, and surreal operation, one superpower cleaning up the deadliest mess left behind by its former rival. A final secret chapter of the Cold War played out by men in hazmat suits on a ghost island in a dead sea. The fact that this cleanup was necessary is the most damning indictment of the original program. The technology didn't vanish. It was irresponsibly abandoned, left like a landmine for someone else to find and disarm. But the real question remained, how much of the anthrax and the other pathogens tested here had already been carried away by the wind, embedding itself in the toxic dust that now blows across the region, a permanent, invisible threat. The enigma of Vosrazhdenia Island is not that a secret facility existed, but the manner of its disappearance. It wasn't dismantled, it dissolved. The political system that created it collapsed, and the ecosystem that contained it collapsed simultaneously. This synchronicity of failure is the psychological core of the story. It is a perfect metaphor for the hubris of the entire Soviet project, a belief that nature and politics could be bent to human will without consequence. Here the consequences were absolute. The island, the sea, and the state that built the weapon all vanished, but the weapon itself, in its most elemental, patient, in microbial form, endured. It outlived the men who made it, the ideology that justified it, and the very geography that was supposed to contain it. The ultimate horror of Vosrazhdenia is the realization that when you create a thing that cannot be unmade, you are betting against the future. And eventually, the future always calls your bluff. The island of rebirth became a testament to the fact that some things can never be reborn, only buried. And sometimes, the grave itself walks away. You are standing inside a cavernous hangar at the Baikonur Cosmodrome, the air thick with the dust of fallen empires and the silence of abandoned ambitions. Before you, though now you must conjure it from photographs and memory, is the shape of a machine that was once the future, the Buran orbiter, the Soviet Union's formidable answer to the American space shuttle. Its name means blizzard, and on a cold November morning in 1988, it lived up to that name, roaring into the sky on a pillar of fire, a white ghost against the gray Kazakh steppe. It was a perfect flight, a technological triumph that stunned the world. And then it vanished. Not in a catastrophic explosion, but in the quiet, creeping death of budget cuts, political dissolution, and a profound loss of purpose. The verifiable fact of Buran's story is as impressive as it is tragic. On November 15, 1988, the orbiter designated 1K1 launched uncrewed atop the most powerful rocket in the world, the Energia. It circled the Earth twice, its systems performing flawlessly in the vacuum of space. Then, 206 minutes after launch, it began its descent. Guided by a sophisticated onboard computer network, it navigated the fiery crucible of re-entry, and in a feat, the American shuttle was never designed to perform. Executed a fully autonomous perfect landing on the runway at Baikonur, touching down with pinpoint precision despite a stiff crosswind. It was the first time in history a reusable spaceplane had completed a mission from launch to landing without a single human hand on the controls. It was a masterpiece of automation and aerospace engineering. The culmination of a program that began in 1974 and involved over 1,000 companies across the Soviet Union. It proved that the USSR could not only match but in some respects exceed the capabilities of its rival. To understand why this marvel of technology was grounded forever after its first flight, you have to understand the psychology behind its creation. The Buran program was born not from a pure desire for exploration, but from a deep-seated military paranoia. When the United States announced its space shuttle program, Soviet military analysts saw not a peaceful transport vehicle, but a potential weapon of terrifying capability. They imagined it swooping down from orbit to drop nuclear bombs on Moscow, or using a robotic arm to snatch Soviet spy satellites out of the sky. To them, the American shuttle was a first-strike weapon masquerading as a delivery truck. Buran was the answer, a symmetrical response designed to negate that perceived threat and provide the Soviet Union with its own military spaceplane. It was built for a war in the heavens that thankfully never came. And when the Cold War ended, Buran became a solution to a problem that no longer existed. The bizarre, almost cruel, detail that serves as the story's final, bitter cipher is the fate of the orbiter itself. After its historic flight, Buran was put into storage in its hangar at Baikonur, awaiting a future that would never arrive. And there it sat, gathering dust, a relic of a bygone era. Then, on May 12, 2002, the hangar roof, weakened by years of neglect and poor maintenance, collapsed under the weight of a heavy storm. The one and only Buran orbiter to have ever tasted space was smashed to pieces, destroyed not by a rival superpower or a catastrophic failure, but by gravity and rust. It was a profoundly mundane and ignominious end for a machine built to conquer the stars. Other unfinished orbiters lie abandoned in other hangars, decaying monuments to a dead dream. The vanishing of the Buran program was a slow administrative process, a death by 1,000 cuts. The Soviet economy was already in terminal decline by the late 1980s, and the 20 billion rubles spent on the program made it an unaffordable luxury. When the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991, the program lost its political and financial foundation. On June 30, 1993, Russian President Boris Yeltsin officially terminated the project. There were no civilian tasks for Buran, and as one cosmonaut noted, the military ones were no longer needed. The program was grounded, its potential sealed away in engineering diagrams and a single, perfect flight log. The technology didn't disappear because it was flawed. It disappeared because the world it was built for had ceased to exist. But the real question remained. What does it mean when a society proves it has the technical genius to reach for the stars, but loses the political will to leave the ground? You are standing on a desolate, wind-scoured patch of the Kola Peninsula in the Russian Arctic, the air so cold it feels brittle. Before you is not a grand monument, but its opposite, a hole in the ground, welded shut with a thick, rusty metal cap. This is the final anticlimactic tombstone for one of the most ambitious scientific projects in human history. This is the Kola Super Deep Borehole, a project that vanished not into myth, but was so profound that it created a myth more durable than the drill bits it shattered. For over 2 decades, Soviet scientists drilled deeper into the Earth's crust than anyone had before or has since, reaching a true vertical depth of 12,262 meters, over 40,230 feet by 1989. The verifiable fact is that this was a pure science project, a geological quest to understand the composition of the Baltic Shield, one of the oldest parts of our planet's crust. And the discoveries it made were extraordinary. You are reading the project's actual logs, and they are filled with wonders that rewrite geology textbooks. The scientists expected to hit a layer of dense basalt rock around 7 kilometers down, a boundary known as the Conrad discontinuity. They never found it. Instead, the granite just kept going. They found liquid water at depths where it should have been boiled away by heat and pressure. Trapped in the microscopic voids of the rock for billions of years, they found that the rock itself was saturated with hydrogen gas, which boiled out of the drilling mud. And, most astonishingly, 6 kilometers beneath the surface, in rock over 2 billion years old, they found the microscopic fossils of 24 species of single-celled marine plankton perfectly preserved. The project was a staggering success, a journey that revealed a planet far stranger and more complex than imagined. And then, in the early 1990s, the drilling stopped, and a different story began to be told. You are now listening to a grainy, 17-second audio clip that has haunted the internet for decades. It is a cacophony of wailing, a chorus of agonized screams that seem to echo from a vast fiery chamber. This is the sound that, according to legend, was recorded when the Kola scientists, in a moment of curiosity, lowered a heat-resistant microphone into the borehole. They had breached the ceiling of hell, the story goes, and the sounds they captured were so horrifying that they immediately sealed the hole and abandoned the project in terror. The well-to-hell myth was born, spreading like wildfire through religious broadcasts and nascent online forums in the 1990s. The anomaly, the unnatural sound, became the project's entire identity. The scientific marvel was forgotten, replaced by a terrifying urban legend. The truth behind the sounds is the story's mundane, almost comical twist. The recording is a hoax. Audio experts and investigators have traced the sounds back to the looped and distorted soundtrack of a 1972 Italian horror film called Barren Blood. The myth was not a discovery. It was a fabrication, likely started by a Finnish newspaper and amplified by those who found it a useful parable. The scientists at Kola did record sounds, but they were the groans and creaks of the earth itself, the rumble of rock shifting under immense pressure and the hum of seismic activity deep within the crust. The project was not halted by fear of the supernatural, but by a much more terrestrial demon, heat. At 12 kilometers down, the temperature reached 180 degrees Celsius, 356 degrees Fahrenheit, far hotter than their models had predicted. The drill bits, the mud, the electronics, everything began to melt and fail. The project stopped not because they had drilled into hell, but because they could no longer afford the funding to invent tools that could withstand it, especially after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. The bizarre, quirky detail that serves as the perfect cipher for this entire episode is the bolted metal cap on the hole. It is a physical, tangible object that seals not a gateway to the underworld, but a monument to human curiosity and its limits. Yet, for those who make the pilgrimage to this remote site, the cap is irresistible proof that something is being hidden. It transforms a simple act of sight closure into an act of cosmic concealment. It is a lock that invites you to imagine a monster behind the door. This metal plate is the anchor for the myth, a silent, ironclad witness that refuses to debunk the story, even as science does. It's the final perfect prop in a global piece of psychological theater. But the real question remained: why do we, as a species, seem to prefer a terrifying lie to a beautiful, complex truth? The vanishing of the Kola superdeep borehole is a unique case. The technology didn't vanish, it hit a wall of physics. The project didn't vanish, it was defunded. What vanished was the truth of the project, replaced by a ghost story. The psychological reason is clear. The concept of a 12-kilometer deep hole is intellectually staggering but emotionally sterile. The idea of accidentally drilling into hell is emotionally electrifying. The myth provides a narrative, a moral, sense of forbidden knowledge and cosmic consequence that a dry geological report, no matter how fascinating, cannot. The unnatural sounds were not in the hole, but in our own collective unconscious. A projection of our deepest fears onto one of the deepest places we have ever reached. We heard what we were afraid we would find. And in the end, that is the most unnatural sound of all. You are navigating a maze of declassified documents and aerospace journals, your fingers tracing the faint outlines of a machine that was designed to be a ghost. You're hunting for the Soviet invisible helicopter, a project that, by its very nature, sought to erase itself from the moment of its conception. The search is frustrating, the trail deliberately cold. Unlike a tank or a missile, a successful stealth program leaves no shadow, no echo in the archives. Its absence is its primary signature. The verifiable fact that grounds this search is not a specific Soviet prototype, but the universal physics of stealth itself, the careful shaping of surfaces to deflect radar waves. The use of radar-absorbent materials RAM, the suppression of infrared signatures from engine exhausts, and the muffling of rotor noise. These principles are well understood, and their successful application by the United States was made dramatically public with the reveal of the F-117, Nighthawk, and later, the wreckage of a modified stealth Black Hawk helicopter left behind in the 2011 raid on Osama bin Laden's compound. The Soviets, brilliant and paranoid in equal measure, were undoubtedly engaged in the same research. The question is not if they tried, but what became of their efforts. You are examining the design lineages of the great Soviet helicopter bureaus, Kamov and Mil, looking for anomalies. And you find whispers. The most persistent rumor clusters around a machine known as the Kamov Ko-58, or the Black Ghost. It exists almost entirely in speculative drawings and brief, uncorroborated descriptions. The Phantom Ko-58 is often depicted with a sleek, faceted body, an enclosed rotor hub, and internal weapons bays, all classic stealth features. It is said to have been a response to the American RAH-66 Comanche program, a black reconnaissance and attack helicopter that was itself a child of the shadows. A multi-billion-dollar project that produced 2 prototypes before being canceled. The story of the Ko-58 is a perfect echo, a ghost chasing a ghost. There is no hard evidence, no official confirmation that the Ko-58 ever flew. It remains a tantalizing enigma, a piece of speculative military hardware that may have existed only on paper, or perhaps as a classified mock-up, before the funding and the Soviet Union itself dissolved. This is a new kind of vanishing, a disappearance that may have happened before the object ever truly appeared. The technology vanished not from a museum or a battlefield, but from the drawing board. The psychology here is one of competitive paranoia. In the high-stakes intelligence game of the Cold War, the mere suspicion that the other side was developing a new capability was enough to launch a counterprogram. The RAH-66 Comanche forced the Soviets to act, to design a response. But building a true stealth helicopter is fantastically complex and expensive. It requires not just advanced aerodynamics, but mastery of composite materials, advanced coatings, and sophisticated engine shrouding techniques. It's possible the Soviet Union, with its economy beginning to buckle in the late 1980s, simply could not afford to turn the blueprint for the Ko-58 into a flying machine. The invisible helicopter vanished because it was too expensive to make it visible. The bizarre, quirky detail that serves as the cipher for this story is the very name given to the Phantom helicopter, the Black Ghost. The name is a perfect piece of psychological branding, an acknowledgement that the machine's primary attribute is its own non-existence. It is a weapon that haunts the imagination. Unlike the Caspian Sea Monster, which was a very real, very loud, and very visible beast, the Black Ghost is a whisper. Its power lies not in what it could do, but in what it might have done. It is a blank space on the map of military aviation, and that blank space creates a sense of unease, feeling that something is being deliberately withheld. The lack of evidence becomes, paradoxically, a kind of evidence in itself. For those who believe in a deep, hidden history of Soviet technology, the fact that no records of the Ko-58 can be found is not proof it didn't exist, but proof of how successful the cover-up was. You must consider the alternative, that the Soviet approach to stealth was not to build a dedicated, invisible helicopter, but to incorporate stealth characteristics into existing designs. There is some evidence for this. The Kamov Ko-50 Black Shark, a revolutionary single-seat attack helicopter with coaxial rotors, was noted for its small size and reduced radar cross-section compared to its American counterpart, the AH-64 Apache. It featured extensive use of composite materials and a design that minimized its heat signature. Was the Ko-50 and its 2-seat successor, the Ko-52, the real inheritor of the Soviet stealth helicopter program? Did the radical dream of the Black Ghost simply dissolve into a series of practical, incremental improvements on a conventional, but still very deadly machine? This is a more plausible, if less dramatic, form of vanishing. Not a disappearance, but a diffusion. The secret project didn't die. It was absorbed, its DNA scattered across the next generation of hardware, its most radical features toned down to be more affordable and maintainable. But the real question remained. In the clandestine world of military research and development, does a program truly vanish if its core ideas survive and evolve in other forms, hidden in plain sight? You are strapped into a virtual reality simulator in a dimly lit control room, screens flickering with grainy telemetry data from a launch that never quite happened. You are reliving the ascent of Polyus, Soviet Union's audacious attempt to place a massive space-based platform in orbit, a machine designed not for peaceful exploration, but for the ultimate high ground of space warfare. Launched on May 15, 1987, aboard the Energia rocket, the same booster that would later carry Baran Paulus, was an 88.5-ton behemoth, 17 meters long, equipped with lasers, particle beams, and self-defense systems intended to dazzle or destroy enemy satellites. The verifiable fact is that the mission was a partial success. The Energia performed flawlessly, delivering its payload to the desired altitude. But Polyus itself failed catastrophically due to a software glitch in its attitude control system. The platform, programmed to automatically stabilize after separation, instead fired its thrusters in the wrong direction, tumbling out of control and burning up in the atmosphere over the Pacific Ocean in a matter of minutes. A technological marvel vanished, reduced to harmless streaks of fire across the night sky. You are digging deeper into the classified blueprints, piecing together what Polyus was meant to be. Officially, it was a prototype for a space tug, a versatile orbital vehicle for deploying and retrieving satellites. But the truth, declassified in fragments after the Soviet collapse, reveals a far more aggressive purpose. Polyus was the first component of the SCIF program, a constellation of orbital battle stations designed to counter American SDI Star Wars initiatives. It carried a low-power carbon dioxide laser for anti-satellite ASAT operations, capable of blinding sensors or damaging solar panels at distances up to 1,500 kilometers. The platform also housed a 1 megawatt class laser in development, along with particle beam accelerators and a complement of homing rockets for self-defense. At its core was the so-called maneuverable module, allowing Polyus to rendezvous with, inspect, or neutralize hostile objects in low Earth orbit. This was not a science experiment. It was a weapon platform, a floating fortress meant to dominate the ultimate battlefield. The Soviet leadership saw it as essential parity, a way to neutralize U.S. space assets and protect their own constellation of military satellites. You are now in the nerve center of mission control at Baikonur, the tension palpable as the countdown reaches zero. The launch itself was a spectacle, the Energia, with its 4 core engines and 2 strap-on boosters, thundered into the sky, carrying Polyus sideways in its payload bay to avoid the platform's own thrusters interfering with ascent. Separation occurred at 175 kilometers altitude, and for a brief moment everything was nominal. Then the glitch. Polyus's onboard computer, burdened by redundant safety protocols, misinterpreted the separation sequence and initiated a 180-degree yaw maneuver. Instead of orienting for orbital insertion, it pointed its main thruster directly toward Earth, accelerating its descent. Ground controllers watched helplessly as the platform's laser system, ironically self-destructed in a test fire meant to verify functionality, blinding its own sensors in the process. The $2.5 billion project ended not in triumph, but in a fiery re-entry, its debris scattering across the ocean like confetti from a failed parade. No pieces were recovered. Polyus vanished completely, taking its secrets to the bottom of the Pacific.
Ow.
This vanishing is a masterclass in the fragility of space-based ambition. The psychology of the failure is telling. The Soviet space program, already strained by economic woes in the arms race, could not afford such a spectacular loss. The SCIF program was quietly shelved, its follow-on modules cancelled amid Gorbachev's perestroika reforms. Polyus became a ghost, its existence downplayed in official narratives as a mere test article rather than the orbital weapon it was. The lack of wreckage amplified the mystery, and like a crashed aircraft, there was no smoking hole to dissect, no black box to recover. It allowed rumors to flourish, that Polyus had succeeded in secret, that it was a cover for a more advanced system, or that the U.S. had interfered with cyber means, a claim echoed in later disinformation campaigns. The bizarre, quirky detail that serves as the cipher for Polyus's story is its unconventional launch configuration, strapped horizontally to the Energia's side, like a surfboard on a rocket. Polyus was a visual oddity even in the secretive world of Soviet spaceflight. This awkward pose was necessary because the platform's thrusters and solar arrays made a vertical stack impossible, without risking premature ignition. It's a perfect metaphor for the entire project. A brilliant, ungainly contraption forced into an unnatural role by the imperatives of Cold War one-upmanship. The image of this massive laser-armed satellite riding shotgun on the world's most powerful rocket captures the era's blend of genius and desperation, a machine too big for its mission, too ambitious for its budget, and too secretive for its own good. You are reflecting on the broader legacy of polyus, a vanishing that reshaped the architecture of space militarization. The failure accelerated the end of aggressive Soviet space weaponization, paving the way for arms control treaties like the 1987 INF Treaty and later discussions on space de-weaponization. Today, echoes of polyus live on in Russia's continued ASAT testing and China's orbital maneuvers. But the platform itself is a cautionary tale. In the race to weaponize the heavens, even a single glitch can send your dreams plummeting back to Earth. Polyus didn't just vanish, illuminated the thin line between orbital dominance and orbital debris, a lesson that spacefaring nations have yet to fully heed. But the real question remained. In an era of resurgent space rivalries with private companies and nation-states alike, reaching for the stars, how many modern polyus-like platforms are being built in secret, only to vanish in a cascade of code and consequence before they can ever fire a shot? You are descending into a sub-basement laboratory beneath Moscow's Institute of Biomedical Problems, the air humming with the steady drone of refrigeration units and the faint chemical temps of preservation fluids. This is where the Soviet Union's boldest bioastronautics dream lived and died in secret. The quest to place cosmonauts in a state of artificial hibernation, or artificial hypobiosis. For interplanetary journeys that would span years rather than months, the verifiable foundation is thin, but real. Declassified CIA documents from the 1960s reference Soviet bioastronautics research that substantially exceeded U.S. efforts, including intensive studies of prolonged spaceflight stressors and man-machine relationships during extended time periods. Among the whispered priorities was research into metabolic suppression, the ability to slow human biological processes to a crawl, reducing oxygen consumption, food requirements, and radiation exposure during the long voyage to Mars that Sergei Korolev himself advocated for. The psychology driving this research was stark. If humans could not be put to sleep for the journey, they would go mad, starve, or sicken before reaching their destination. You are examining the theoretical framework that guided these experiments. Rooted in observations of natural hibernators and extreme human survival cases, Soviet physiologists, led by figures like academician V.V. Perrin, studied documented instances of Russian peasants surviving prolonged exposure to freezing temperatures by entering trance-like states, their metabolic rates plummeting to levels that defied conventional medical understanding. These cases, dismissed as folklore in the West, were treated as empirical data in Soviet labs. Proof that the human body retained dormant mechanisms for hypobiosis that evolution had suppressed but not erased. The research drew inspiration from Tibetan monastic practices of tummo meditation, where practitioners claimed to regulate body temperature and entered death-like states for days, a psychotechnology Soviet scientist attempted to replicate and induce artificially through pharmacology and controlled hypothermia. Animal models, ground squirrels, hamsters, and bears were subjected to blood transfusions from hibernating specimens. With some success in inducing torpor-like states in non-hibernators, the leap to humans, however, required crossing an ethical and technical chasm that Soviet secrecy could obscure but not eliminate. You are now in the archival silence, where the trail grows cold and the disappearance becomes palpable. No public records survive of human trials in cryogenic hibernation chambers during the Soviet era, yet the infrastructure for such experiments existed, sealed isolation chambers designed for prolonged sensory deprivation, liquid nitrogen cooling systems ostensibly for preserving biological samples, and biomedical monitoring equipment capable of tracking vital signs at extreme hypothermia. Rumors persist among former institute staff of deep cold experiments in the late 1970s, where volunteers or prisoners were subjected to gradual cooling while sedated, their core temperatures lowered to the edge of clinical death before attempted revival. None of these alleged subjects are named in any accessible archive. Their existence, if real, was scrubbed as thoroughly as the hidden cosmonaut deaths that also never officially occurred. The program's disappearance mirrors its objective to render life invisible, suspended, erased from time's ledger until a future awakening. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the research fractured into civilian cryonics. Startups like Crearis, founded in 2005 by transhumanist activists who openly freeze the dead for future Revival, but the military bioastronautics applications were quietly shelved, deemed too speculative or too dangerous to continue without state support. The bizarre, quirky detail that serves as the story's cipher is the post-Soviet emergence of Krioris itself, a company operating out of a backyard shed near Sergiev Posad, where founder Danila Medvedev stores dozens of temporarily dead patients in liquid nitrogen vats originally designed for ballistic missile components. This is the public face of what was once state secrecy, enthusiasts with modest resources doing openly what Soviet labs allegedly did in shadow. Medvedev's rhetoric referring to corpses as patients floating like children in the womb echoes the bioastronautics language of the 1960s. When cosmonauts were envisioned as embryonic travelers awaiting rebirth on distant worlds, the continuity is eerie. The same physiological principles, the same liquid nitrogen, the same leap of faith that death is reversible if the structure is preserved. Yet where the Soviet program vanished into classification, Krioris operates with transparency, its clients listed, its methods published, its vats photographed for international media. The inversion is complete. The secret becomes spectacle. The forbidden becomes commercial. And the technology that was once too revolutionary to admit now struggles to attract customers willing to pay $36,000 for whole-body preservation. You are reflecting on the legacy of these vanished chambers. A technology that never achieved its stated purpose, but seeded questions that persist today. Modern research into suspended animation for trauma patients and long-duration spaceflight builds on the same hibernation biology. Soviet scientists explored decades ago, with U.S. Department of Defense funding now supporting clinical trials that rapidly cooled gunshot victims to buy time for surgery. The European Space Agency and NASA openly discussed torpor for Mars missions, citing hibernating mammals as proof of concept. Yet none acknowledged the Soviet precedent. A deliberate amnesia that mirrors how classified programs vanish, not by being disproven, but by being forgotten, their findings sequestered or repurposed without attribution. And the chambers themselves, if they existed, were likely dismantled or repurposed, their liquid nitrogen vats reassigned to mundane cryogenic storage, their monitoring equipment salvaged for hospital use. No plaques marked their location, no memoirs confessed participation. But the real question remained. In an era when humanity again dreams of interplanetary colonization and lifespan extension, are we rediscovering technologies the Soviets explored and abandoned? Or are we inheriting their unspoken failures, doomed to repeat experiments whose outcomes were deemed too dangerous or too disappointing to ever share? You are descending through the hazy, sulfuric clouds of Venus in a simulated descent, the pressure building like an invisible hammer against the reinforced hull of your craft. This is the world the Soviet Venera program sought to conquer, a hellscape of 460 degrees Celsius temperatures, 92 atmospheres of pressure, and acid rain that would melt unprotected metal in hours. Between 1961 and 1984, the USSR launched 29 missions to Venus under the Venera banner. A relentless barrage that outpaced all other nations combined and yielded the only direct surface data we have from our sister planet. The verifiable triumphs are etched in black and white. Venera 7's 1970 soft landing returned 23 minutes of temperature and pressure readings before succumbing. Venera 9 and 10 in 1975 delivered the first surface photos, blurry panoramas of orange rock. Venera 13 and 14 in 1982 captured color images drilled into the soil and even recorded the planet's eerie winds. Yet for every success, there were vanishings, probes lost to launch failures, silent entries, or communications blackouts that left scientists staring at empty telemetry screens. You are poring over mission logs that reveal a pattern of abrupt disappearances where robust landers went dark without explanation. Venera 3, the first to reach Venus in 1966, entered the atmosphere, but fell silent before impact, its fate unknown. Did the parachute fail, or did the crushing descent short its circuits? Venera 11 and 12 in 1978 touched down successfully but transmitted no images. Their lens covers jammed by pyrotechnic mishaps, rendering cameras blind while instruments hummed on. The Vega 1 and 2 landers of 1985, dual-purpose craft that dropped balloons into the atmosphere before landing, lasted only 56 and 57. Minutes on the surface, their signals cut off not just by Venus's fury, but by the orbiting bus moving out of relay range. Cosmos 482, the failed 1972 Venera backup, never left Earth orbit and has drifted as space junk for over 50 years. Its re-entry predicted for May 2025, a final vanishing back to Earth. These losses were not always total. Faint echoes persisted, like Venera 7's weak signal discerned from noise after it rolled on landing, antennas askew. But the silence that followed each touchdown is profound, a void where data trails off into the planet's roar. You are delving into the psychological toll on the ground teams. You faced Venus, not as a distant target, but as an adversarial force. A Russian roulette of engineering where success was measured in minutes. Soviet designers. Under immense pressure to beat America, NASA's Mariner 2 flew by in 1962, but never landed. Iterated ruthlessly. Spherical landers to distribute pressure, hermetic seals against acid, pyrotechnic cooling to buy time. Yet failures bred fatalism. After multiple orbital losses like the three 1962 Molniya launches that exploded on the pad, the program became a graveyard of ghost ships, probes that reached but could not report. Post-mission analyses were classified, hiding not just technical glitches, but the human engineers demoted. Budgets slashed, fueling rumors of suppressed data on Venus's habitability or anomalous signals. The vanishings amplified Venus's mystique, turning it from a cloudy sibling into an impenetrable shroud, where lost landers became metaphors for the era's secretive space race. The bizarre, quirky detail that punctuates this saga is the pyrotechnic lens cap fiasco of Venera 11 and 12, where explosive charges meant to jettison protective covers instead fused them in place, leaving the cameras staring at nothing while the probes dutifully measured wind and soil. It's a comically tragic Rube Goldberg failure. Fireworks designed for revelation becoming instruments of blindness, ensuring that despite perfect landings, the world saw no new vistas. This glitch, repeated from Venera 9/10, underscores the human element in cosmic exploration ambition thwarted by a faulty squib. A reminder that even in the void, small bangs can echo into eternal silence. You are gazing at faded panoramas from Venera 13, the last clear glimpse of Venus's surface before the program's end in 1984. Coinciding with the USSR's waning resources and the Challenger disaster's chill on planetary ambitions, the lander's remnants, if they endure, lie scattered under shifting dunes of metal snow, their titanium hulls corroded, instruments oxidized, a silent testament to Soviet tenacity. Modern missions like NASA's Da Vinci and Veritas aim to revisit. But the Venera ghosts linger, their vanishings a cautionary archive. Venus devours its visitors, and the data they carry dies with them unless transmitted in time. But the real question remained. In an age of rovers roaming, I send probes orbiting distant worlds, why do the Soviet landers' final silences still whisper of a planet that hides more than it reveals its surface a canvas? For lost ambitions rather than conquered frontiers? You are standing inside a heavily shielded, windowless concrete chamber, the air thick with the metallic temps of ozone and the ghost of immense instantaneous power. For you, stretching the length of the hall, are two parallel steel rails, scarred and pitted, flanked by massive capacitor banks that look like a city of gray monoliths. This is the skeleton of a weapon that promised to make gunpowder obsolete, a machine that hurled projectiles, not with chemical explosions, but with a pure, controlled bolt of lightning. This was a Soviet magnetic railgun, and its last shot echoed into a silence that has lasted for decades. The verifiable fact is that the Soviet Union, in lockstep with the United States, invested heavily in electromagnetic launch technology throughout the 1970s and 1980s. This was a Cold War arms race, fought not just with missiles, but with physics itself. The goal was to build a weapon that used a powerful homopolar generator and capacitor banks to dump millions of amperes of current into two conductive rails. Solid metal projectile, or armature, placed between the rails would complete the circuit. The resulting Lorentz force and intense magnetic field would then accelerate the projectile down the rails at astonishing speeds, Mach 5. Mach 7 theoretically even higher, releasing it with a kinetic energy that would make conventional artillery shells look like children's toys. Soviet research at institutes like the IOFI Physical Technical Institute in Leningrad was at the forefront of this field. Prototypes were built, and projectiles were fired. The Thunderbolt was real, then it vanished. The program disappeared from the public record in the late 1980s. Its funding evaporating as the Soviet economy entered its final shuddering collapse. The reasons given for its termination were brutally practical. The technology was monstrously inefficient. The sheer electrical power required to fire a single shot was enough to brown out a small city. The rails themselves, subjected to unimaginable temperatures and magnetic stresses, eroded catastrophically with each firing, sometimes lasting only a handful of shots before needing to be replaced. The weapon was a maintenance nightmare, a delicate laboratory instrument masquerading as a piece of battlefield hardware. With the dissolution of the USSR in 1991, the entire project was deemed an unaffordable fantasy, and the research teams were disbanded, their knowledge scattered in the great brain drain of that era. The psychology of this disappearance is telling. The railgun is a weapon of pure elemental hubris. It is a physicist's dream, a way to command the fundamental forces of the universe. Its appeal is primal, seductive. To abandon it was to make a reluctant, painful admission that raw power is not the same as military utility. It was a concession that a weapon must be more than just powerful. It must be reliable, affordable, and logistically sustainable. The vanishing of the Soviet railgun program was a quiet surrender to the mundane. Realities of engineering and economics over the spectacular promises of theoretical physics. The dream of the Thunderbolt was defeated by the price of replacing the rails. But the real question remained: did the research truly die, or did it simply go deeper into the black, its core principles repurposed for other, less grandiose applications? The bizarre, quirky detail that has become the story's enduring cipher is an anecdote that circulated among the program's engineers. During a full-power test firing in the mid-1980s, the electromagnetic pulse EMP, generated by the capacitor discharge, was so immense that it not only fused the facility's own monitoring equipment, but also caused a cascade of electrical failures in a nearby town, plunging it into darkness. The accidental test of the weapon, secondary effect as an EMP generator, was a stark demonstration of its untamable power. The story, whether apocryphal or not, perfectly captures the project's dilemma. The weapon was a danger not only to its target but to everything around it, including its own infrastructure. It was a beast that threatened to break its own leash with every roar. The magnetic railgun did not vanish because it didn't work. It vanished because it worked too well, in ways that were too wild, too expensive, and too impractical to be tamed into a reliable weapon system. But the knowledge was not lost. The principles of pulsed power, high-energy capacitors, and electromagnetic acceleration are foundational. Did the research teams simply migrate, their expertise flowing into other classified projects? Perhaps into the development of electromagnetic armor, which uses a similar pulse of energy to deflect incoming projectiles. Or into naval systems, where the immense power requirements could be met by a ship's reactor. The last shot of the Soviet railgun may not have been an end, but a dispersal, a scattering of technological seeds that would sprout in other, less conspicuous corners of the military-industrial complex, their lineage deliberately obscured. You are seated in a soundproofed, windowless room, a numbered folder on the table in front of you. It contains a single sheet of paper with a set of geographic coordinates. There is no map, no photograph, no description. Your task is simple, yet impossible. Close your eyes, clear your mind, and journey to that location, reporting back on what you see. You are a psychic spy, a soldier in a war fought not with bullets, but with consciousness itself. And you are part of a unit that, in the official records, never existed. A unit that was trained, deployed, and then suddenly, inexplicably, disbanded. The verifiable fact is that for decades, both the Soviet Union and the United States were locked in a psychic arms race. Driven by mutual paranoia and the fear of a psychic gap, each superpower invested millions in programs to weaponize extrasensory perception, ESP. The American effort, famously known as the Stargate Project, ran from the 1970s until its declassification. In termination in 1995, its Soviet counterpart was larger, more secretive, and, according to concerned CIA reports, potentially more advanced. From the 1960s onward, research institutes and secret military units operating under the oversight of the KGB and the SPSB Ministry of Defense worked to train remote viewers, individuals believed to possess the ability to psychically perceive distant places, objects, and events. Their mission was espionage at its most fundamental, to bypass all physical and electronic security and steal secrets directly from the enemy's mind or from deep within their most secure facilities. The psychology of this strange battlefield was one of profound uncertainty. The programs were built on a foundation of tantalizing anecdotes and statistically significant but often ambiguous laboratory results. A remote viewer might accurately describe the shape of a gantry crane at a secret Soviet missile site, but misidentify the missile itself. Another might correctly sketch the layout of a building, but be unable to read the documents inside. The intelligence produced was often vague, symbolic, and notoriously difficult to act upon. A 1995 review of the American Stargate project concluded that while some results were statistically significant, the information was never clear enough to be used for actionable intelligence. The Soviet program likely faced the same frustrating limitations. The psychic spies could see ghosts, shadows, and echoes, but they struggled to deliver the hard, verifiable data that a satellite photograph or a human agent could provide. The bizarre, quirky detail that serves as the story's cipher is the recruitment and training of the viewers themselves. These were not super soldiers or scientific geniuses. They were often ordinary people, an administrative assistant, an artist, a musician who showed a flicker of natural aptitude and were then subjected to rigorous, mind-bending training protocols. They were taught to enter a state of relaxed awareness, to quiet the mental noise of their own thoughts, and to allow images and sensations to flow into their minds. They would then sketch or describe these impressions, which would be compared against the real target, often without the viewer ever knowing if they were right or wrong, to prevent failure from damaging their confidence. It's a surreal image. A small group of seemingly average citizens in a quiet room in Fort Meade or a dacha outside Moscow, their minds tasked with penetrating the deepest secrets of a rival superpower. And then they vanished. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, the psychic spy units were quietly disbanded. The funding dried up, and the institutional support evaporated. In the new, chaotic Russia, a program built on such esoteric foundations was an easy target for budget cuts. It was an expensive luxury from a bygone era of existential paranoia. The disbandment wasn't a single dramatic event. It was a slow, administrative fade-out. The soldiers of the mind were simply let go, their contracts terminated, their security clearances revoked. They were returned to civilian life, carrying with them the secrets of their strange trade. The official narrative was simple. The program had produced no conclusive results and was no longer needed. The vanishing was explained away as a simple act of bureaucratic housecleaning. But the real question remained. When a state trains a person to be a weapon, and that weapon is the person's own consciousness, can that person ever be truly decommissioned? You are walking the marble-floored corridors of Moscow's storied science academies in the early 1990s. The air alive with chatter in a dozen languages, and the rustle of portfolios stuffed with equations and patent drafts. This is the moment the brain drain truly begins, the mass migration of Soviet scientists, engineers, and program heads to the West and beyond, carrying not just their diplomas and research notes, but an entire generation's worth of classified insight and experimental intuition. Here, in smoky conference rooms and new laboratory wings at MIT, Oxford, and Los Alamos, the boundary between what was Soviet technology and what becomes global innovation blurs almost overnight. The verifiable historical fact anchors this diaspora from 1990 to 1995 alone. An estimated 1 million scientists and engineers left the former Soviet Union, fleeing collapsing research budgets and a society in free fall. Many were absorbed directly into Western institutions, often on expedited visas, working on everything from computational algorithms to jet propulsion. The more spectacular cases made headlines: laser physicists recruited for missile defense, virologists offered posts at BSL-4 labs in the United States, and materials scientists snapped up by multinational conglomerates eager for their titanium forging expertise. But for every success story, Dozens more faded quietly into new roles, designing semiconductors in Israel, writing cryptographic code in Silicon Valley, or advancing composite armor technologies in private defense startups. You are reading between the lines of patent filings and government memos. Finding the patterns that reveal the true extent of the brain drains price. It was not just human capital that moved west, but a corpus of classified procedures. Black project documentation and the whispered details of programs never meant for declassification. The Soviet nuclear propulsion concepts were incorporated into European and American research, sometimes disguised as new proposals. Weather modification and radio frequency manipulation papers seeded advances in M-weapons research, and clever decontamination solutions found their way into proposed countermeasures against chemical and biological threats. A single émigré scientist might bring with them the blueprint for a pulse detonation engine, or a hard-won fix for mechanical failure and cryogenic storage tanks, fixes that embodied the hidden loss of entire Soviet institutions, thwarted in the economic storm. Psychologically, the brain drain is a wound and a revelation. For Western security agencies, it was a triumph. Each newly arrived PhD, a small intelligence coup, each debriefing a window into decades of Soviet rivalry. For the Russians who left, it was survival mixed with loss, a confession that science, no matter how high-minded or pristine, cannot exist on patriotism alone. The decision to erase an affiliation on a CV or redact a research history from a grant application was a psychological defense mechanism, a way to make the old identities disappear, replaced by a new, borderless citizenship of innovation. Those who remained behind watched entire departments hollow out. Research priorities vanish overnight, and the sense of collective endeavor dissolve into 1,000 smaller pursuits. The quirky, enduring cipher of this era is the sudden appearance of unusual materials and concepts in Western patent filings, in open-source literature. Just years after corresponding breakthroughs were classified secrets in the Soviet Union, unmanned underwater vehicle designs, superconductor fabrication tricks, and complex mathematical models of atmospheric optics simply appeared in peer-reviewed papers and white papers abroad. Their Soviet heritage politely ignored or quietly footnoted without context. Stories circulated, never proven, often half-true, of scientists with alphabet agencies at their doors asking for explanations of diagrams found in briefcases or diskettes, as if the Cold War's vanished tech was leaking into the broader world one quiet life at a time. But the real question remained: how does a society measure the cost of what is lost, when what disappears is not only technology or a scientist, but the possibility of a future that was abruptly, permanently redirected? Does history properly record what was given up, or do those vanished aspirations simply become the foundation stones of some other country's success? The brain drain is true prices paid in unseen progress ideas that would have bloomed under their own flag, now flowering somewhere new. You are standing at the end of a corridor lined with locked doors, each one marked by a faded plaque, a lost project, a silenced voice, a shuttered lab. This journey began with a question: why did so many extraordinary Soviet technologies vanish, slipping through the cracks of history, memory, and state secrecy? Here, at the threshold, the answer resolves not into a single revelation, but into a tapestry of decisions, patterns, and accidents woven by decades of ambition and caution. The verifiable truth comes into focus. Soviet technological disappearances were rarely accidents of engineering alone. Some machines, like the Caspian Sea Monster and the Buran shuttle, vanished into neglected dreams that outpaced their budgets, or were simply orphaned when the world changed around them. Others, like ballistic missile command systems and bioweapons research on Vozrezhdenia Island, disappeared by deliberate design, erased to safeguard national secrets, protect reputations, or prevent catastrophic misuse. Still more, like the lost cosmonauts, magnetic railguns, and psychic spy programs, were buried beneath layers of myth, rumor, and partial disclosures, sometimes encouraged by those in power, sometimes simply the byproduct of a culture that thrived on silence and shadows. But what truly shocks, at the core, isn't the vanishing of hardware or the disappearance of files, it's the deeper conscious vanishing of context and purpose. When technologies were rendered invisible, it wasn't just out of shame or rivalry, but because revealing them threatened to unravel fragile balances of power, both inside the USSR and across the world stage. The act of classification wasn't just an administrative gesture. It was a psychological tool for survival, a way for leaders to navigate between danger, obsolescence, and exposure. Even successes like Lunicod or the Perimeter System were masked in legend or shrouded in partial truths, their real stories lost in a haze of controlled forgetting. And yet in every corner of this maze, human hands remain visible engineers improvising with salvaged electronic scientists, pushing against ethical boundaries, officers reshaping history in the files they kept or destroyed, and ordinary people left to interpret these vanishings through rumor, folklore, and hope. The most unsettling discovery is that the Soviet vanishing wasn't a one-time purge or a single conspiracy, but a sustained policy, a habit of mind that made disappearance itself a strategic asset. Technologies didn't merely fail or succeed. They were managed, curated, hidden, and sometimes even staged to vanish on purpose, safeguarding what could not be openly defended. Now, at the end of the story, you are asked to consider the chilling implication. If the vanishing was intentional, then every mysterious silence, every unexplained program's end, and every vanishing voice is not just a loss, but a warning. It's a signal that the power to erase history is as potent as the ability to make it. The Soviet legacy is not only what was created, but what was hidden, controlled, or let fade into noise. Now, in this moment, pause. Let the gravity of everything that has been lost by design, by accident, by the slow erosive currents of time settle like radioactive dust across the ledgers and the landscape. For a long breath, the labyrinth grows quieter. The tension softens. Every vanished artifact, every locked file, every forgotten experiment becomes, for just a heartbeat, wholly real, not as a relic, but as a question that will always wait for an answer. Now dim the lights, prepare yourself, and let's unravel this hidden truth together.